Good old boys.
I'm Mark.
Bog Beef. Special guest, Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin. You can find him at Gray. I've just read everything in it today. What's that?
Oh, fuck. I'm really fucked now. It's Gray Mirror with an A. .substack.com.
It's amazing.
It's different.
Been into your work for a long time. All your older writings are on unqualified reservations. Stuff he wrote back in like 2008. It all basically came true now. So you have to write more.
Yeah, he called a shot like Babe Ruth.
Yeah, some of that was a little more accurate than I would have wanted. There are certainly some things I got wrong, but it was interesting because so you can read my older writings, which run to really hundreds of thousands of words. It's a monstrous piece. You can also buy them on Amazon. Some very nice person has put up collections whose revenues actually go to me. But I was writing this blog from 2007 to 2013, and it so happened that I started a company in 2013. And the idea of having a blog like this, I mean, that was an age of unparalleled internet freedom, right? But the idea of having a blog like this and running a company even in 2013 was ridiculous. So I shut down the blog, and as it happened, I shut down the blog, sort of just in time for the whole thing to turn into this giant shit show. Now, I was never like a cult leader. I was never like, oh, this is like a movement. I have contact with these people. I get them. I brand their vaginas. Like I'm not that kind of guy. But as it happened, whatever sort of involvement in this scene I had, I shut down in 2013, which was exactly the right time to basically shut that down and kind of let those writings kind of age a little bit. But you can read them all on unqualifiedreservations.org. They could have more coherence. They were all first drafts. They were not written, entirely in a complete state of sobriety. But they're there and you might enjoy them. And people have been looking at them lately and being like, wow, this stuff was really not as obvious back then, but it's freaking obvious now. I think it was pretty obvious then, actually. But
maybe for you. I mean, we were reading political forums, Bog Beef and I, back then, and I saw your name mentioned when like in 2008 around that time, and people were saying, "Oh yeah, you heard about this idiot? He wants to restore the Stuart monarchy," and so I never read any of it until years later. And then, in 2007, I think it would have been a hard sell to a lot of people to convince them that progressivism was the dominant ideology of America.
Yeah, well, what's funny is like I can also relate to how unconvincing that is because, I'm so old that, since this is the Good Old Boys, podcast, people will appreciate this. I went to Fairfax County Public Schools in the great state of Virginia in the early 1980s. And at that time, it was so long ago that we had Virginia history, and the Virginia history included the full Dunning School, history of Reconstruction. So we got our scalawags and our carpetbaggers, right? And so here you have, these 8-year-olds being taught what scalawags and carpetbaggers are. Now, I'll bet you're a little bit younger than me, Mr. Beef, and you probably didn't have any scalawags and carpetbaggers in your elementary school history.
That's the thing. So I'm Merrick's from Virginia. He knows everything about Civil War. I'm from the Deep South. Like, to me, like when I think of I grew up with when I was born, I was pulled from the yaw of eternity, and the first thing they did was drape me in the Stars and Bars,
right,
to take my first picture. However, I never knew where Gettysburg was. To me, the rebel flag was what you put on your bass boat, or
Right. So this is not. You wouldn't consider yourself a scion of urban Democrats exactly. Your heritage is a man of the people. You're more of what they might call a cracker. Are you a cracker by descent? Maybe a cracker with a nice bass boat. Is that correct?
Man.
Yeah.
It's a trick. Don't do it. He's trying to dox you.
I mean, you have. I mean, you a kulak, basically.
Yeah. So I mean, in the South, there was always if you've read, Richard Weaver's, The Southern Tradition at Bay, or anything like that, or even, Albion Seed. You must know Albion Seed. Do you know Albion Seed?
2 days ago, I was told I had to read this.
Yeah, you have to read Albion Seed. And Albion Seed is basically like, look, most people think of America as a country that was stolen from the Indians by the white man, but there were actually 4 separate groups of white man involved. And these were basically the Puritans, the Quakers, the Cavaliers, and the Crackers, or the Borderers, basically. And the Borderers or Crackers came from kind of this border country between Ireland and Scotland, in which basically the pure unmixed Neanderthal stock had survived.
I've been telling him this for years, but to no avail.
We're the white people you see on Cops and country music.
Hey, to be fair, my family started out as Cavaliers, but some things happened in the middle of the 19th century, and they mysteriously fell on hard times.
The way you know that you're Scots-Irish is that, like I do, like I had never heard of it. The way you know you're Scots-Irish is if your ethnicity is American.
American, yeah. Whereas, the way you know you're Cavalier is if your ethnicity is, Miss Lindsey Graham. Sorry, that was very offensive. But I mean, the bourbon. The thing is that. Here's a trivia question for you. Do you guys know who Clifford and Virginia Durr were?
I'm sorry. Can you give me a spelling of that last name?
Durr.
That's a slur, by the way.
Yeah, you got me on that one. No, I have no idea.
So these were, one of the things you saw a lot of in the New Deal was basically Southern aristocrats of, sort of purebred Cavalier descent, whose children, went to some kind of fancy school up north and became liberals. And so sort of a lot of talent was poached out of the sort of old scions of old Southern aristocracy this way. Now, Clifford and Virginia Durr were kind of the center of this kind of, bitter Southerner kind of scene in D.C. You must know who Jessica Mitford was, Decca Mitford.
Are we going to do this? Are we going to do this all night? You must know who this person is.
Okay. Jessica Mitford, author of the. This is rude. Jessica Mitford. Let me just finish this off. Jessica Mitford was the grande dame of, the great literary and social light of the American leftist movement for most of the middle of the 20th century. She knew everyone. She probably blew everyone. She was. She wrote The American Way of Death, which is a book that you might have heard of, and she was best friends with the Durrs. And you know who else was best friends with the Durrs was LBJ. And so you get these, and LBJ was exactly this kind of person who had this kind of Southern background and became acculturated, ideologically at least, into the Northern elite. So this is not a new phenomenon. So I seem to be interviewing you rather than the other way around. But Mr. Beef, after your so let's pop the stack and get back to where we were, which is the sort of why it's so difficult to see progressivism and this political mercantile class, the PMC as you call it, as kind of the dominant kind of class and structure and ideological structure in our world. And I think a lot of that comes from education. And so, when I started off down in the carpetbaggers and the scalawags, one of the things, I was, again, still in high school in the 80s. And in high school in the 80s, basically, this was in a high school, it was a very American kind of high school. It was Wild Lake High School in Columbia, Maryland, and me and David Byrne are like the notable alumni of the school, which is hilarious. I was not there at the same time as David Byrne. He's older than me, but we were it was made very clear to us as nerds that we were on the bottom of the totem pole, and on the top of the totem pole was like, the student athletes, and a student athlete was like, I'm like, some student athlete is like, he's like this 300-pound lineman, and he's a student athlete because not only is he a great lineman, he got 1,100 on his SATs. And I'm like, wait a second, by the same standard, I'm a great student athlete, so you really feel this kind of Revenge of the Nerds kind of vibe where basically the people, and of course the nerds at the school, this is a school not far from DC, so the nerds of the school are the scions of this PMC, right? And the people who are, the homecoming prince or the football team or the cheerleaders or whatever the fuck are basically what you might call Agro-Americans, because they're from out in Howard County and they grow corn. And then you also have urban Americans, because part of the brilliant idea of Columbia was racial integration. And so you have this little microcosm of America, and it's very clear that who's on top in this microcosm of America are these sort of old-fashioned, power like elites, like the football team, or like, so I had a very bizarre experience at this high school, because the previous school that I'd been to, because my father was a U.S. Foreign Service officer, was an imitation of a British public school in Nicosia, Cyprus. So we had like houses and school ties and memorized poetry and shit, right? In addition, I'm 3 years younger than everyone else. So I go from like school ties and memorizing, Ozymandias and shit to Wild Lake High School as a 12-year-old sophomore. So, with this background, I like walk into, like, I'm told that their like class is suspended, and because there's going to be something called a pep rally.
You've never heard of a
pep rally? Of course, I've never heard of a fucking pep rally, right? So I wander down to like the gym, right? The gym is not really the gym is like out fucking Auschwitz to like this fucking 12-year-old sophomore, right? So I wander down to the gym, which is not exactly the place I'm feeling super comfortable in, and I enter this space, and here's this fucking like Nuremberg experience, right? This like totally unabashedly fascist, I mean, my God, like, what the hell is this, right? And like, this is not America. I mean, what? And so having that experience, maybe it was almost a macrocosm of the experience that many Gen X progressives had growing up, where they're basically put in this system just because it's so old and so backward and so broken that makes them feel like complete underdogs. The thing is, I think for kids in high school today, I think a lot of that has changed, just because these systems have caught up to the real kind of status and power of the world. But yeah, it's really, once you have that feeling of being an underdog, it's tremendously difficult to change it. And my God, with Trump in office, I mean, you're just like,
he's the king of the jocks.
I've been ranting for too long. I got to give you, this is your podcast, not mine. I got to give you an opportunity to talk.
Can I, okay, so for this podcast, I inspired my friends, and they're like, oh, go fuck that guy up. and I was like, look, man, you don't know what it was like back in they have these blog days. I've seen the comments this guy's left. It's not going to go down. It's not going to go down like that. Right? But however,
I'm drinking something.
However,
all right. Give me, throw your hardest shit at me. Why don't you let's get to the, me not letting you talk is not really fair. Let's hear something.
One of the things that's juicy is the dissonant thing. It's that you're reinforcing the power, and I have half this audience is like these left dissonance, and half is right dissonance, right?
That's a nice trick, man. Yeah, I gotta congratulate you on bringing people together like that. That's frankly, totally seriously not easy.
It's not, and I'd fight to keep it, but
yeah.
So you have conversations with these people, right? And so you dissonance. One of the things, a lot of times these are if not true believers, they spend all their time saying that's not what Mark said or blah blah blah, right? And so I've got two quick examples. So there's kind of like the public facing policy of like radicals. No, I don't mean like these people let me in the safe house and I'm ratting what they said. I'm saying there's things that are like implied by the ideology that's not like you don't run. There's optics is the thing. You don't run around saying stuff like this, right? So in the left wing example, okay, so these guys, they throw bombs at the banks and the corporations. They're against the corporations. The biggest story of this year, probably in terms of power. We're all obsessed with power, right? And
of course, it's the only thing that matters.
Exactly. So who's the big winner? Well, it's this guy Bezos. But as much as you could say, I guess he lost half the empire in 2019.
Well, he had a female trouble. I don't. I definitely do not know Bezos, and I don't know why he would do that. I could.
You've got to work in Silicon Valley. Don't get fired. Let me keep going. Okay. So, anyways,
keep going.
All right. So whatever you call them, you talk to left people. Yeah, they'll say that you're right wingers will just lead you to be. I read a piece yesterday that was like if you follow this right populism, you'll be under the boot of Jeff Bezos. If you talk to left people behind doors, they'll say Bezos is basically fucking Lenin. He's because he's going to consolidate all the. They'll say he consolidates all the power. We sign a law or we take over. And then he's collected everything in one little place, so it's very centralized. Or central committee can just take over. Right? Thank you.
I hadn't heard this one before, and I do like to know what people are thinking. And how does this relate to him owning the Washington Post?
Okay, so that's the left. Okay, so the right wing. Okay, so what's the story with these guys? These guys are getting their ass pounded by the Apple, Google, professors, these woke people for their speech. So that they love the free speech. The free speech, right? If you're on the right wing, you want that free speech, buddy. Don't get fired. If you talk to these people, probably they're like, well, of course, whoever's in charge answers only to God. We would have to regulate subversive speech. How could you not? That's ridiculous.
After the revolution, comma.
Right.
Right. Is that your question, or is there a little more to the question?
Well, let me cut to the chase. So the real question. Okay, yeah. So the real question is about dissonance. Does the system, and if we really, really, really cut to the chase, wrote like 5 questions, we can go down to one. Does the system need dissonance? And I would cite every rule. Now if I'm doing a magic trick, this is the part where I palm the ace and I'm doing the thing because I'm going to switch from system to ruler. Every ruler that pulls off a purge dies in office. Most recent example we got is this guy in Turkey, and
Erdogan.
There's a dissident, and they have to keep him in rural Pennsylvania, and he will probably die in office because, like every other guy that's died in office, they purged the dissidents. Is this a contradiction? And I see the floor.
Is it a contradiction to say that when you're for, you're sort of showing the flip sides of two respective, contradictions. First of all, you're noting that when leftists were persecuted, or at least felt persecuted, they cried copious tears about something they called McCarthyism, which my grandparents, who were American communists, were very much affected by. Or felt themselves very much affected by. No, they weren't very much affected by it, but they could have been. You could imagine a case where my grandmother would have lost her job for being a communist, which she was. She was actually a card-carrying communist. I'm not sure if she, carried it. But she was definitely a party member. And when you look at, of course, today you hear. It's not that you hear less about McCarthyism. It's that those stories have to be chosen with great care to avoid people from kind of inverting the mirror, and that inversion has sort of become easier and easier. And so people look at this. I mean, right now I'm working with this film director who was literally blacklisted, right? And he did the exact same thing that people on the blacklist do. You worked under a pseudonym. It was actually much harder for him than for the people on the Hollywood blacklist. So the thing is, what you'll notice is that whoever has the power to blacklist has a tendency to do it. And then when they're out of power and they're feeling weak, they of course complain about being blacklisted. I think what that demonstrates to you is that neither of these groups have a clear definition, a clear and consistent definition of sovereignty, which excludes the right to regulate speech. And that's because I don't think there is such a clear and coherent definition of sovereignty. Moreover, one of the reasons we like this concept of free speech is that it seems very, very clear and simple. In fact, it has all of these, sort of strange little alleys and byways, like what about libel and slander? In fact, you could argue that the most modern part of the modern regime really begins with New York Times versus Sullivan, at which point basically the Supreme Court gives the American press kind of the right to essentially be above what was previously considered the law of libel and slander. And so, and that's, that being above the law is kind of the definition of sovereignty. So I would say that when you look at both left and right wingers, they tend to they kind of deny the pre-revolutionary doctrine of sovereignty, which was, is well known to Aristotle as to Jean Baudin. And so they essentially say, well, each side has the sort of principle of free speech that it sometimes admires and sometimes abandons. So when one side abandons it, of course, the strong is always going to abandon that principle and the weak is always going to admire it. And so, when you ask if that's a contradiction, I would say, no, it's not. One of the problems is, or one of the reasons that you see this contradiction is that it's basically becomes difficult for these people to honestly tell you what their idea of an ideal regime is, because does an ideal regime allow free speech or does it not? And they seem to go a little bit back and forth to that, and the closer they are to actually being in power, the less they admire free speech. When you have a pre-modern interpretation of political science, that doesn't really bother you, and you're basically, state with, Cardinal Bellarmine that there's no right to error. And so then your standard of good government is that it never has to repress the truth, and it only represses foul slanders and lies. That's a hard standard, to achieve, but that's essentially always the way it was seen before the modern era. Does that make a certain amount of sense?
Yes, actually.
Yes. I mean, if free speech, I mean, we're so autistic these days. I think the actual
that's for sure.
If you actually believe that it works as the word said, there's that belief where the words mean things. The word the words define the shape of reality. That if you really believe that, then this is like creating Mad Max Thunderdome of governments. You know what I mean? This is like these we're just going to have just a savage. But whatever. Let's. If we go back to, I mean, I think it's ridiculous, but I can connect that to something another thing I have to feel. The thing is, I have to defend you all the time, and it's not. I'm not. Yeah. I'm not blowing smoke up your ass because I it's like people. Well, that idiot reads it, so I have to.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there are certainly things. I think that if you look at the flaws of my earlier writing, I think that I didn't always practice fully what I preached about basically not trolling. And so, the thing is that when I write now, I basically, my strategy is I never cuck, I never lose my self-respect, I never say things I don't believe in. And I also basically I try to never be provocative at all. And with occasional humorous exceptions. And that's certainly not a standard that I met in my earlier blog. That said, go ahead. I interrupted you. You had a delicate or difficult question.
All right. So one of the beefs I get, and I have to bring these to the floor. By the way, like these complaints I got, I'll get. If I know people that subscribe to graymirror.substack.com, and they say you don't get this is there's good critiques and there's not so good, like I heard a great critique, there was a big write-up of Bronze Age Pervert 2 or 3 weeks ago. They said this guy is too racist to be anti-Semitic.
Yeah, well, I think that do you know where Bronze Age Pervert he got his start in a place called Salo Forum? Do you know Salo Forum?
I'm catching the back end of all this. I know a little bit of it.
Never heard of it.
Yeah. I've never been on Salo Forum, but this is it's run by some crazy Croatian dude who named his forum after simultaneously both Salo, meaning the Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's rump state in 1944, and also it's a reference to Pasolini's film, 100 Days of Sodom, which is set in the an adaptation of Desaad, which is set in the Salo Republic, right? And so this is basically this place of these like sort of very, almost very Fond du Siècle kind of figures. They're really people out of the late 19th century in a way, who've kind of embraced this kind of ideological decadence. And so you kind of, you might say that sort of, I would hesitate to say that they turn racism into an art form, but that's basically what you're looking at there. They're just like, and the attraction is like, it's like this like damnation, it's like La Fleur du Mal, right? It's this sort of Baudelairian instinct that's going on there. And that's basically the world that brought you Bronze Age Pervert. Now, that's not the world that I'm from, but that's basically the explanation that I give when
transgression, right? That's real art or whatever. Transgression's real art.
Transgression, right? How do you transgress? It's the oldest fucking trick in the book, right?
Nothing more transgressive than racism right now.
Anti-Semitism, I think, is still a little stronger, but sure. I mean, basically, the problem is, I can't, as a Jew, I can't really indulge in anti-Semitism because it's just Jewish humor, but so anyway, so let's this is not the culture I'm from, by the way, but you mentioned BAP, and so. I want to, explain BAP for a moment, but let's get back to your question. You had a question.
Oh, okay. So, by the way, it's one of these things. I have to consult with these people, right? And so, this is kind of rare. Like, if I have reading something about like philosophy and politics, I have to like you. I'm not gonna do the like. You have to really like it. I get this stuff where the people this son of a bitch. He won't just get to the chase. They're reading every word. Yeah. They're like, why won't he just format it and in a they just need it. They want it quicker and faster and harder in their veins. And
that's exactly what I don't want to feed. Basically, I'm like I deal exclusively in the finest coca tea. I'm not going to sell you fucking political cocaine. Yeah, sorry, go on.
There's an Anglo thing that's like, well, just remove the parts I don't like and just give me the
yeah, and it's like some people. I'm just like, you're along for. I'm like, you got. First of all, I think one of the things that comes from that is I think that comes from a couple of different things. One is people kind of looking for their political hit. Some people are like, well, get me more transgression. I just want the transgression. Like, throw these, you just gave me this bag of fucking leaves. Now make it into some fucking paste and like draw off the transgression. And that's like, no, I'm not here for that. I actually transgress as little as I can. I need a really good excuse to get transgressive, because otherwise it's just like cheap, and that makes it bad art. And that also makes it just wrong. I'm here to give you quality, right? And then, there are people that, we just live in this sort of short attention span age. I'm like, you think reading me is hard? Try reading some fucking Carlyle. And my third point is, I'm like, you think reading me is hard? Try reading some fucking Marx. Who the hell ever fucking finished fucking Das Kapital? Right? Marx is a wonderful writer. His shorter stuff is generally better. I agree with almost nothing he has to say. I think he was a horrible person, but he was an amazing fucking writer. And it can't be ignored that had a certain impact. And so I'm like, in a way, a little bit of esotericism adds some value in the long run. That's why you kind of have to stick with this kind of long and winding prose. And my other response is that a lot of this stuff, I think my Gray Mirror stuff is tighter because it's actually been edited. I used to just basically I would just dash off in your days. I posted every Thursday night. I would sit down and, 8 p.m. on Thursday night, and, at 5 a.m. I'd, have finished this 6,000 word piece or whatever the fuck. I don't do that anymore, because this is actually, Gray Mirror is actually a book. Just to be clear, the reason to subscribe to my my book, which is more than a blog, is basically you're just getting a sneak peek at this thing that will eventually be something that you can buy on Dead Trees. I don't have a publisher. I'm probably just going to sell it myself. But hopefully there's a little bit less of, my God, the digressions, well, they never stop. I try to rein that in a little bit. But yes, I think that's artistically, that's a criticism that I'm sensitive to. You had another one. You wanted to talk about racism or something like that?
All right, so I was branching that. So one of the big complaints from the old unqualified reservations, and this goes straight from the free speech thing, right? So right. The Puritan guys, you have the source documents. They're kind of irrefutable. However, okay, yeah. There's a separation with they want the Puritan and the Quaker, and I have a little story, right? So,
it's true. Those are not quite the same thing. Those are, yeah, right. Sorry, go on.
Right. So the Puritans were there. The Quaker guys showed up. The Puritans started chopping off body parts.
Yeah, basically. The
Puritans immediately realized this is this is a subversive threat to our community. The Quakers said, you have written down, you have freedom of religion in your laws, except for Catholics. They said, oh,
of course.
They said, oh, we do. Well, I got a ballpoint pen on me. Let's just add in another
yeah,
word
right.
in there. And
you'll find. Sorry to interrupt, but you'll find they always have a ballpoint pen on them.
Yes, there was not right. So, it did not take much feedback to instantiate this. Anyways, they said, we'll give you a date at which you must leave or we kill you. And then the Crown said, no, sorry, you have to tolerate them. And now we live in a hellhole.
Yeah, well, I mean, the history of British North America before the 1770s is very poorly known. Which is insane considering is that it's not that much shorter a period of time than the history of the United States of America, and kind of more crazy shit happened in it, right? I mean, fucking the Dominion of fucking New England, and there were Leslie's Revolt in New York, where mobs took over the city, and crazy shit was happening all the fucking time. Wars between North Carolina and South Carolina. All this stuff kind of just disappears from the history book, but it is whack. And most, you sort of hear a little bit about the Puritans, because a little more about the Puritans, because people used to be conscious that this and maybe Jamestown, but more this than Jamestown was the main.
Because they won.
Because they won, right? So the fucking Puritans were these badasses from Britain, and one of the things that really, I mean, the Americas, it's like Oliver Cromwell. You know Oliver Cromwell, right? He once considered he had some shit went wrong, and he once considered emigrating to America, right? Where the history would have been totally fucking different. Or there's this guy, Sir Henry Vane, Henry Vane Jr., who actually went to America. I think he was a governor somewhere, came back and played a leading part in the English Civil War. And in fact, there's this book, wonderful, wonderful book. I've only read half of it. It's 2,000 pages. I only read the first half about the Civil Wars, by this guy named Edward Hyde, who was later named the Earl of Clarendon. This book was a manuscript that was written in the late 17th century. Hyde comes out of this okay. His daughter actually becomes the Queen of England, but because he serves Charles II. Hyde starts out as a parliamentarian who's basically kind of a moderate liberal, and as 17th century wokeness gathers speed, he's like one of these like Wesley Yang or Jesse Single types, who basically is like, yeah, I know, but it's okay. He's a good guy, right? But he's like, hey, I can't take this anymore, and he ends up on the right, and he ends up basically in Charles I's entourage, goes through the whole Civil War, eventually flees to France, hangs out with Charles II. Comes back in the Restoration and winds up basically governing England for 15 years or something. So it's an amazing story. And he writes these memoirs, History of the Great Rebellion, which are not published until the early 19th century. In fact, the publishing arm of either Cambridge or Oxford, I can never get those straight, is called the Clarendon Press. Because it was first set up to publish Clarendon's History of the Great Rebellion. And so if you read Clarendon's History of the Great Rebellion, which is obviously available for free online, and features noted characters like Sir Henry Vane, and you're just like, you look at Sir Henry Vane as portrayed in Clarendon, you got to get past the 17th century English a little bit, but it's perfectly intelligible. You're like, I know that fucking guy. Like, this guy is a fucking neoliberal. Like, this is a 17th century neoliberal. I don't usually like using that jargon, but, this is basically like, he always has a ballpoint pen on him. And, when the law is in his favor, he'll plead the law. When anything else is in his favor, he'll plead that. And he's just like, everything he says is like this sort of self-serving, power-hungry lie. I mean, this guy's just a shit. And he's like Napoleon's great line about Talleyrand, he's shit in the silk stocking. And you're just like, until that time, you read about the English Civil War, and maybe you did an AP history or something, and it's like this list of battles or whatever. You never imagined that these people could be actually like the people that you knew in sort of public life today, and of course they were. And you just you read through the eyes of Hyde about these Puritans, these parliamentarians, the Roundhead side of the Civil War, and you're just like, my God, I know these fucking people.
Yeah, reading about the trial of Charles is it's incredible. I don't know how to describe it. You can kind of see how the whole thing fell apart after Cromwell died, because these are people. You're amazed that they're actually. I was just amazed that they were actually able to kill the king, because it seemed like they. Like, how would you fuck up a show trial? But it can be done.
Did you, Bob? Did you study history, or were you? What was your? I imagine you went to some kind of fancy university after your bass boat, origins.
I went somewhere. I drank for a couple of years, and That's,
out of curiosity, what would you say is the largest hog you ever caught?
I used to. You ever been to any nightclubs in Tennessee?
No.
Let's just keep moving.
I was actually referring to largemouth bass, but that's okay. Let's just keep moving.
Yes, I'd stay out of the freshwater stuff.
Yeah, they don't taste too good. Sorry, go on.
Okay. Did you guys have any more? This he's the history guy here.
No, please don't say that to Curtis Yarvin.
All right, so
he's gonna ask me if I've read 15 other books that I've
but
done.
I mean, the thing is, what you're describing, reading about the English Civil War, is I mean, it's basically, it's like there's this moment when history kind of snaps from like black and white 2D into like full color 3D, where you're like, fuck, I know these fucking people.
I've got so you ever meet these communist people and they know every millisecond of the Spanish Civil War and like all the mysteries of the universe are tied up in that. I'm like that for basically Julius Caesar, right? And it's the same. It's the same thing. It's like I know, like I refuse to. My friends say you should watch this HBO show Rome and all that stuff. I can't. I know these.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I have that experience with. I don't have that. I don't know Rome that well, but I have that experience. Like I had that experience with HBO's John Adams, which was very good with the parts of it I saw. But I'm just like, I can't fucking watch this. It's like it's too close to being good. Can I do something really embarrassing on your show?
Go for it.
I got to do, since you mentioned Julius Caesar. I got to do parent brag. My parent brag is that. My lovely daughter, in fact, was just cast in a production of Julius Caesar, in a high school production, and she's 12, and she was cast as Caesar.
Oh wow!
I'm like
the future's female.
Yeah, future. You got to watch out for this girl. Yeah, I'm not even slightly kidding. Yeah. So So do you want to talk about Caesar for a moment? I was just reading a little bit of Tom Holland's Rubicon. What a fuck. Sorry. I wanted to start some shit. What you say? I guess looking. When I got to chapter 3, I was like, I know he's got to bring up Caesar. Was it 4? 4 is the big long one where you start getting. 4 is the big long one.
Yeah, 4 big long one of Gray Mirror, Substack.com, $10 a month. Get it. I was like, I'm reading it. I'm like, okay, you must address these kinds of things don't go down very often. And what you wrote was fucking beautiful. And I was like, okay. And let me read it here because I think this is. I really like this. The old conflict was an artifact of broken politics. It was sustained only by each side's fear of the other. The new monarchy, by depriving both factions of all power to assault the other, leaves neither with a reason to exist and no politics at all. Who will miss it? Did Virgil lament Rome's loss of Milo and Clodius, Marius and Sulla, the social wars, Catiline and his dirty crew? God.
Yeah.
Was Augustus you're a great hero?
That, do you?
No.
Sorry, what'd you say?
You don't disagree with that. You don't disagree with my history there, do you?
The Virgil lament Rome's loss, that part I really love. We can get into the other part.
You're like I know Roman history so well that Milo versus Clodius, I have a side in that. He's like, Milo did nothing wrong.
No. The fact that when it swept away, when whoever butchers they sent to just round these guys up, no one, I'm sure people said, hey, is that guy that cross-dresser?
Everybody regretted, Kikaro's death, right?
Not this good.
Well, not at that moment, but later, it was I think that the writers of the Empire generally respected and admired, his writings wouldn't have survived otherwise. Right?
They did for sure. It
that's
really.
What I meant. I didn't meant that nobody was like, God damn, finally that motherfucker's dead. I'm breaking out the Falernian wine. Right? I'm sure that was the thing.
Right. Like basically, I got all this bullshit that was, things were building. All this bullshit. As soon as it was gone, it was a relief. No one. How quickly the people don't give a shit as soon as someone steps in and here's one. Seattle. We had there's bands that'll come and just pick you up and take you somewhere, and no one and that. and that's against the Constitution, all this stuff, and that's going on, and no one cares, right? Because they figured out, they're like, oh, well, we got the DA, and he won't touch us, so we'll just burn this whole city down. So people say, well, no, a van will just come pick you up, and you'll be gone, and that's it. And people are like, okay, I guess that's fine.
What else are you going to do? I mean, that's kind of the degradation of politics that happened late in the Roman Republic, where basically you had these institutions that people trusted and respected because, politics had gotten ugly. Politics had already been ugly in Rome for basically a century. But there was a time when, people in the Roman Republic really trusted and believed in these in these institutions. And they felt that, if you were indicted in the forum and the public convicted you, then you were probably fucking guilty. And by 50 BC or whatever, people, were like, oh, if you were indicted and convicted in the forum, basically that was just war. You just lost a war. It doesn't make you a bad person. Whereas when, Cicero prosecutes Verus, people are like, people clearly still believe at a certain level in the integrity of sort of these kinds of democratic trials by rhetoric that they had at this time. And so what you're seeing that is reminiscent of the late Roman Republic is this kind of sort of declining faith in these institutions that were previously seen to be kind of objective and Olympian and sovereign, and now they're starting to be seen as human and fallible. Is that where you were going with this, or did you have a different direction?
Okay. First off, this guy's serious because I don't know if you ever connected it, but you clearly must be thinking it. When you talked about sequestration.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a not everybody does this, but if you really are starting out from very little and you want a force multiplier, you make it. It costs you a lot up front, and Caesar was killed by people who he had forgiven, but I really don't think that matters very much. However, so you just every time you make it clear, everyone knows if you give up, this guy will forgive you quickly. You can get your job back.
Yeah. That's
sorry.
huge because Caesar. One of the things that Caesar and Augustus both did this basically, and there's this great anecdote about Caesar that I like to tell, which it just says so much about our conflict today. My history here may not be completely accurate. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I think he may have actually done this twice. I think he may also have done this after Pharsalus. But the story I remember is from the victory over Cato in Africa. Now, Cato is really the last of the Romans. Everybody respects Cato. Everybody knows that Cato has these old-fashioned values. And he's a real Roman, and he's kind of the last of the Republican forces, and he's hanging out in Africa, North Africa, of course. And Caesar takes his legions down there and kicks his ass. And Cato commits suicide in this very kind of Japanese kind of way. He basically cuts his own belly and then has the slave cut his head off or whatever. The slave tries to put his intestines back in, and he tears them back out because he's such a fucking Roman. Right, so this guy is Roman as fuck, but he's an old school Roman. Caesar is a new school Roman. Caesar kicks his ass and captures his headquarters. And in his headquarters is this big chest, and the chest is full of letters, from his friends back home in Rome. And as you know from Roman history, obviously you were alluding to this earlier. One of the fashions that had been one of the sort of normal things in Roman violent politics that had been normal, especially in the conflict of Marius and Sulla, was this thing called proscription. And what proscription means is you're a rich dude, you supported my enemies, therefore you must pay. Here's how you will pay. We will kill you, we will take your shit, and we will give it to my friends. That's proscription. So very, very, very significant process, very, very effective, obviously. And so Caesar captures Cato's tent, and in Cato's tent is this giant chest full of letters from his friends back home. So, of course, what some people would do in an environment like this is they would be like, well, here's what I could do. I could be friends with both sides. So I could send nice letters to basically both groups of people. Well, that's cool, except what might happen is that somebody might capture these letters. So Caesar has this opportunity to basically find out who his real friends are by subtracting from that set the set of letters that are in this chest. So Caesar's guys are like, fucking awesome, let's start going through these letters right fucking now. And Caesar's like, okay, here's what you're going to do with this chest. And his guys are like, what? Tell us. And Caesar's like, you're going to take it, you're going to cover it in olive oil, and you're going to set it on fire without even fucking opening it. And his guys are like, what? What the fuck? Why? And Caesar's like, you don't get it. We won. They're all our people now. Mm-hmm. And so, like that sort of sense of like, they're all our people now is something that's sort of really missing from, like, you don't see that really in a sense in either side in American politics today.
Okay, sure.
You
but
certainly see people lying and saying that they believe that, but my God, don't believe those lies. I mean, and that's just like, that's sort of the missing ingredient in sort of all of these kinds of political structures. I'll give you another example of this, which is there's a book called it's called Der Führer. It's about Hitler, and obviously a lot of books have been written. Obviously, a lot of books have been written about Hitler. Are you guys hearing this? Okay? You said delay?
No, I was making a joke. We're on an 8-second delay. You can talk about Hitler.
So yeah, a couple 2 or 3 years ago, my daughter, who I need to have this like kind of Tony Soprano talk with my daughter soon. But my daughter basically, knows nothing of my secret. I mean, she knows I have a secret identity, but my daughter's like, Pop, why do you have so many books about Hitler? Well, this book is called Der Führer, and its value is that it was written by an anti-Nazi journalist before World War II. So it's just basically, you can find anti-Nazi portraits of Hitler, everywhere, but it's sort of hard to find ones that don't consider World War II and the Holocaust as things that already happened. Like Hitler is seen from the 30s is very different. And it was translated into English. I don't read German, but, it's sort of basically a piece without that element of hindsight. And so, all historians agree that Hitler was a marketing genius, and, basically he could sell, like nobody's business. That's obvious. And so anyone, the corollary of that fact is that anyone who wants to learn to be a good marketer can learn from Hitler. So there are basically like, millions of Americans out there who work in marketing, who could be reading Mein Kampf just for this purpose. Not that I recommend that, but the man was a genius at this. And one of the things that he did that this author, whose name isn't Karl Hess because that was a libertarian from the 60s, I'm drawing a blank on the name right now. One of the things that Hitler did in the 20s, and in the 20s in Germany, there were a lot of people who wanted to be Hitler. There was a lot of it was sort of the first wave of this German nationalism. And most of the people who wanted to be Hitler were better than Hitler, basically. Which is one of the fucked up things about sort of how this came out. But Hitler was a better marketer. And one of the things that Hitler used to do when he was selling his political front, so, back in the 20s, of course, there were all these very different German constituencies. There are the rich, the workers, the soldiers, the peasants. And what most people would do is sort of they would do normal politics, and they would go and talk to the peasants, and they would say, I'm the guy for the peasants. And then they would go and talk to the soldiers, and they would say, I'm the guy for the soldiers. And what Hitler would do is he would go and talk to the peasants, and he would say, I'm for the peasants, but you have to remember that the peasants are not the only people in Germany. The peasants are just one part, and I'm for all of Germany, and I'm for the peasants, I'm for the workers, I'm for the capitalists, I'm for the bourgeoisie, I'm for everybody. Unfortunately, he wasn't for the Jews. And if he'd been for the Jews, he probably would have won. But he might not have won the election, which is what, of course, fucked up there. And sort of that principle in government of sort of being able to say, I'm going to sort of defeat you because you're the party of one faction and I'm the party of everyone. And that idea of being the party of everyone and sort of the question of how you even are the party of everyone in this world is a very, very unanswered question. But, you know, there's a lot of people that are like, oh, I'm going to fake being the party of everyone. Yeah, everyone does that. But being, you know, the real thing of being the party of everyone is really extremely hard. I'm curious as to that was a rant, but in a way that was a question. I'm sort of curious as to your response to this question, because you have this kind of mixed ideological background.
Sorry, can you restate the question?
The question is basically how, in the context of this American,
do you be party of everyone? Do
you become the party of everyone? And not faking being the party of everyone, but becoming really the party of everyone.
The military.
I'm
not joking. It's the only institution people still believe in. It has a hierarchy that's established. It's integral part of the thing existing. It's very results. I should say, it should be very results oriented. That's probably it.
No shit, man. No, I mean the military is great. Like I like, you know, I learned, you know, one of the things as a diplomat or diplomatic kid, you of course meet military kids, and you're introduced to this completely different world of the military. You know, my wife is actually a military brat, so I sort of know something of that world, which is this, like, you know, the military is almost like the Amish. It's this like completely different culture that somehow exists within ours. I think unlike the Amish, it doesn't have its own religion, and so it's kind of being coordinated in a way, and it's certainly to call it results-oriented in 2020, I think, is a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. It should be, but and also because it doesn't have its own religion, obviously they're doing their best to infect it, right? I mean, we see this every year more. I doubt it would happen with the general staff. It would probably be like a colonel's revolt.
Yeah. But I mean, there's sort of no, like, it's hard to. I mean, you might say it should be, but it's unlikely because that's sort of not. It's so contrary to their ethos. It's more like, you know, if you could imagine, you can't really imagine a colonel's revolt in the U.S., but you can imagine a figure like Trump, if you knew what he was doing, basically saying, okay, I'm sort of going to use this latent force, which is the the colonels of America who aren't, politically savvy enough to be promoted to general. That's something that could be reactivated. That's a culture that could be reactivated in a sense. I don't know that it can activate itself in some kind of whack-ass Latin American sense, because that's, again, very foreign to its tradition.
We can agree that if we had a MacArthur today, that he would eventually be in charge, right?
Yeah, well, that was sort of offered to him in a way, and he sort of refused. But I mean, I certainly have great respect for MacArthur. I mean, Japan is what it is because of MacArthur, right?
That's real cultural Marxism, what we did to Japan.
Well, the thing is, it's what we have to Japan, because, like, Japan is still the most, it's the most alien country in the world in a lot of ways, and it's nowhere near as alien as it was in 1930 or, my God, 1830. But it's still, MacArthur kind of left it alien in some ways. And so, I mean, MacArthur was working with, his occupation administration had a lot of New Dealer staff. I mean, as you may know, the Japanese Constitution was written by like a 27-year-old Jewish woman.
The actual business of the CIA basically was writing these things. I totally agree. The military as an institution is defeated. It's like, all the top generals went to Harvard and shit and blah blah blah. How would I start? A guy who came up from the military would probably be good.
Wait. Let's get some. Can we get some context here? Sorry, you're basically like, okay, how does Caesar happen in the 21st century? Being something of a student of Caesar.
Yes. Well, first off, this is something I wonder, because you don't talk about patronage very much. Like, okay, so I think generally, I think politics 99% of the time operates on these guys represent, it's just patronage, right? These are representatives. They represent this interest, that interest. You have little small windows. Maybe these windows are what is the only way to break things. You have little small windows where your patronage IOUs become totally worthless, right?
Well, let me stop you right there and disagree very slightly with you, because I think at the top level, I think in sort of society in the modern world, it's like, I think one of the mistakes, it's like you were talking about Bezos earlier, right? And I think one of the mistakes that sort of leftists generally make about power in our era is that they confuse money with power. And I think that at the highest level of society in the modern world, it basically depends on this kind of alchemy of converting money into power. And the alchemy doesn't happen automatically. Just because you have money doesn't mean you have a lot of power. I don't think Bezos has a lot of power. And when I look at the kind of sort of financial corruption that I see in sort of the modern system of government, it seems kind of sort of penny ante to me. The real sort of corruption seems to be about this kind of, sort of, it's like power is almost sort of more a form of cocaine than a form of money. And you see people basically going after power like it was cocaine. It's almost like drugs in prison or something like that. Like the whole sort of economy sort of turns into this sort of desire for importance and status and impact and relevance. And if you mean that's the kind of sort of corruption that you're talking about, I would agree with you. If you think that it's sort of more financially oriented, corruption, maybe we could, dig deeper into that.
Let's go to a different Silicon Valley figure. Maybe I'm thinking of more Willie Brown than Jeff Bezos. Is Willie Brown powerful?
I think Willie Brown is mostly retired at the moment. I think Willie Brown is content to be retired, and I think he is not. I don't know if he's doing to any extent like the Deng Xiaoping thing, where he's like powerful behind the scenes. I do know that his ex-girlfriend is running for vice president, but certainly in his day he was very powerful.
If you one of the things the left people talk about all the time is identity politics, right? And so the identity politics is very powerful because the government is kind of like it's a open mic night. And you remember this? Joe Biden had this phrase where he said. They said, well, what about this and the black people? They said, well, these black people don't vote for you. So, well, if you don't vote for me, you're not black. Okay.
If you ain't kinfolk, you ain't skinfolk, or you may be skinfolk, but you're not kinfolk. Is the line that is the black line that I've heard. And yeah, that was a sort of that was an interesting statement. I'm be interested in how you dig into that statement.
So it's totally true from his. So if you look at the perspective of the ruler, you're this guy in D.C. How what are you communicating to? Like what? And so if I'm this guy in D.C. and I'm doing stuff, and 95% of people that are like this communicate to me that they like me and want to vote for me, then now we have a relationship. Mm-hmm. Right, and so this is how. So 60% of the people who went to the polls in South Carolina, they told exit pollers, they said, this guy Jim Clyburn, I voted for whoever he said to vote for because
right.
And all he does small things, not big money. So he'll do. here's the difference.
Yeah.
Every time he like builds a DMV or something in that county, he makes it very clear, and he explains, like, he says, this is how I put this bill. I stick a rider in it because I'm on this committee, and I got the rider in, and I got 4,000 jobs in your county.
Yeah. That kind of patronage. I know it well, and there's this wonderful term that they came up with in India, and of course they speak English in India, but they speak kind of weird English. If you've ever read Indian English, you'll notice the articles start to disappear and sort of strange things like that happen. But there's this wonderful Indian term which is vote bank. And a vote bank is exactly what you think it is. It's basically a group of voters that you can trust because they're voting for these kinds of tribal, communal reasons. And I think that voting for basically tribal, sort of communal reasons it's almost kind of a pre-modern form of politics, you might say. I mean, sort of chronologically it's modern, but I feel like we haven't really said anything really kind of controversial or offensive for a while. So maybe we could go there. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, hell yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that people don't know or don't understand when they talk about the Old South is that when most people if you talked about, most people haven't heard of the 3/5 clause at all. But those who have heard of the 3/5 clause, which is one of the more embarrassing things in our Constitution, where if you're European or something listening to this, I don't know why that would be, but if you're European listening to this, the 3/5 clause is a clause in the U.S. Constitution which says that for purposes of voting, an African American is defined as 3/5 of a human being. That would be 60%. Or a slave rather, which was not completely equivalent, basically the same thing, is 60% of a human being for the purposes of apportioning districts. And so it's an astoundingly, it's just sort of sounds like an awful thing, right? And if you're studying the history of this, the history of the drafting of the Constitution, you'll find that the 3/5 clause was of course, a clause of significant debate between the North and the South. And you might think that in that debate, of course, since the South are Southerners and therefore racist, and the North are Puritans and therefore proto-woke, that the North would be arguing for, this compromise, how do you get to 60%? One side is like 100% and the other side is 0%. And you might think that the side that was for 100% was the northern side, and the side that was for 0%, it's like, we don't really consider them humans at all. They're more like objects, like a table or something, was for 0%. And of course, as you probably know, being Southerners and having some studied some history, you did know that it was exactly the other way around, right?
Yes.
Yes, right. So what you realize when it's the other way around is that you're kind of going back, in a sense, to a much more an older, more aristocratic sort of version of, and more Roman really version of republicanism, where you're basically saying, these slaves are like part of my family. And so actually, if you're familiar with, I don't know if you know this, but are you familiar with the etymology of the English word family?
No.
Probably not. It comes from the Latin word famulus. Mm-hmm. You know what famulus means? Mm-hmm. It means slave. So basically, when you talk about your family, you're talking about your slaves. And I think about this all the time.
You're your dad.
We were different on the black. They're the 3/5, but we all had it right on the women, though, right?
Yeah. and that was the subject of universal agreement between North and South. So when you dig into the sort of 3/5 mentality, where you're like, why would the South be for 100%? And they would be for 100% for an obvious reason, which is that gives them a larger population, which gives them more representatives. Okay, that's kind of the simple version of this. The more complicated version of this is to say, okay, when you're doing apportionment, when you're doing sort of democracy at all, you're measuring kind of the potential power of this unit. And so it is very natural, the kind of normal thinking of like the sort of the plantation owner, or whether you're talking about a plantation owner or like a medieval baron in England, is kind of the same mentality. It's basically like, my importance as a patron is measured by the number of my clients.
Yes.
And so as a baron, you know, you'd see other barons at parties. You're hanging out with parties, and you're like, oh, how many peasants do you have? It's like, oh yeah, I recently acquired these farms, and I have 3,000. You know, 3,000 good, hardworking peasants. You're like, wow, that must be so tough. That's a huge step for you. You know, I've got 20,000. It's a totally different experience. You know, that's sort of what determines your social status, is basically the number of people that as a patron that you have this kind of patron-client relationship to, right? And of course, you know, as an expert in Roman history, you basically, that's huge in Rome. Like, your house in Rome is this kind of like patronage office where all your clientes come and receive gifts and favors from you. And basically how many clients you have, again, establishes what a big man you are. And that was very much felt, you know, sort of both economically and politically in the Old South. And so when you basically fast forward that into the modern world, one of the things about, you know, when you talk about patronage, the kind of feeling of modern politics is that you've sort of gone from personal patronage to a kind of bureaucratic patronage. So, you know, and here we get to the controversial part. So one of the things that's done after the South is completely conquered is, you may have heard of the Freedmen's Bureau. You've heard of the Freedmen's Bureau? You know,
they did a bang-up job, by the way.
Sorry?
They did a bang-up job, by the way. If you look at the stats on the mortality rate.
I assume you're saying that ironically. You know, a recent piece of research estimated, I think this is totally wrong, but at least it was legitimate published research, estimated that like a quarter of the African Americans in the South died after the end of slavery. That number is way too high. At most, this was tenth, but it was still fucking heinous. And that's really to be laid on the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was basically essentially said, okay, here are these people who have been essentially treated as dependents until now. Basically, someone has to be responsible for them. Okay, we are, because we just won the war. And so essentially what it sort of, from a Southern perspective, the Freedmen, you know, what the North had done with the Freedmen's Bureau was not so much as to end slavery as to nationalize it. And so they sort of said, okay, rather than being the clients of individual Southern Bourbon Democrat barons, these slaves are going to be the clients of this government department. And that didn't really sort of sit well with a 19th century, even 19th century liberal perspective. And that department never worked well. They never gave anybody 40 acres and a mule. You know, it was just a complete shit show from beginning to end. And it was just horrible.
Yeah, I've heard this
for the slaves. All right, I've said enough here. You're gonna rip into that as
No. I want to get your opinion on this. We've heard the 40 acres and a mule thing a billion times. Bog and I talked to a lot of leftists, and they often say, well, you know what should have happened after the war ended? What should have happened was all the property of the planter should have been confiscated and handed over to the slaves.
So we should have been more like Zimbabwe.
Exactly. So, from your perspective, as someone a very intelligent guy, you've written a lot. How could that turn out any way other than, well, now you're going to have a lot of banks who within a year of time of you executing this harebrained scheme, they're going to own this property because the people, as you said, these are people who were dependents up until
yeah, and that, I mean, I think there were some incidents of some kind of confiscations like that, and it ended up. I'm recalling there was this whole town somewhere in Louisiana or Texas that was founded by the slaves of Jefferson Davis's uncle or something like that, his uncle or his brother. This was this like super enlightened Southern plantation owner who was like, I'm going to like turn my slaves into like a really, you know, amazing community, and did a good enough job at it that they basically formed their own city after the end of slavery. Unfortunately, I'm forgetting the name of this town. And but the people who were like the leaders of this town eventually like lost their property financially and had to revert back to renting it. And I think that did happen to a fair percentage, although nowhere near all of the African Americans after slavery, that they basically lost the land that they'd been given and turned back into sharecroppers. And of course, as you know, sharecropping was this absolutely brutal fucking existence, right? You know, where you basically had gone from formal slavery to what's essentially debt slavery. And, you know, I'm not, you know, it's not at all. That was certainly a good change in some ways, but by no means always. Would you agree with that as Southerners?
I would, nice try, you're not getting me fired. But I would say that there's always a danger when someone has that kind of power over you, but they don't have any obligation to you.
Yeah, no, that's you're clearly you know, studied in the language of, you know, the other you know, really, you know, difficult thing that I want to say about slavery here is the principle of that reciprocal obligation, where, you know, you put your sort of finger on it. It's like people have that kind of power over you, but they have no obligation to you. And that idea of reciprocal obligation is sort of crucial to. There was never really a very strong ideology. It's certainly crucial to the idea of slavery as it's existed at all times, and it was kind of crucial to kind of the nascent ideology of slavery that was developing in the pre-war era. And it was to some extent a reality. It was much more a reality than like Virginia than in Mississippi. This is why the fear of being sold down the river is so sort of huge, because you're basically going from this kind of extended family version of slavery, which is relatively benign, to this much more kind of Roman latifundia, sugarcane, work you to death kind of establishment. And of course, slavery in the Caribbean is even worse than that, right? You know, camp, and where basically, you know, slavery in the Caribbean, slaves are basically like slaves in America are breeding at above replacement rate. Slaves in the Caribbean are not. They're worked to death, right? And you know, like, it's like, okay, this is a machine you buy that wears out after 7 years. So this is very, very contradictory to this sort of pro-slavery ideology, which is like, oh, they're part of our family or something. So maybe in Virginia or in like Jefferson Davis's uncle or something, like, you know, this ideology is a reality. And in other places, it's like the fucking gulag or the fucking death camp. And Southerners look down on those like gulag death camp. Like the slave trader was like this despised individual in Southern society, or at least kind of, you know, Tidewater society. You know, but that shit did exist. You know, it's like, and so you have this sense of, but if you look at the sort of the ideology of like what this thing was supposed to be in the eyes of its defender, this idea of reciprocal obligations is enormous. And of course, Carlyle, you know, writes about this, the great, you know, English defender of slavery, writes about these reciprocal obligations quite a bit. Now, if we fast forward that into the modern world, you know, sometimes you'll hear people complaining about the quote gig economy. You know, like Uber is evil. Why is Uber evil? Uber is evil because basically it tells you what to do, but it doesn't give you any benefit. I'm like, well, that kind of rings a bell. and or you'll sometimes hear liberals, you know, they'll compliment the Japanese model of lifetime employment, where you start with the same zaibatsu and you're never fired for all your, and they take care of you for your whole life and your retirement, and you basically don't change jobs ever. And I'm like, well, and so, you know, it's like, you know, Carlyle has this great line where he's like, well, you can destroy the name of slavery, you can abolish the name of slavery, but you can never abolish the phenomenon. And you know, the experience of being a sharecropper in the 1870s, 1880s, let alone the fucking late 1860s, I don't think they'd even invented it quite then yet, was so fucking brutal that, like, you know, to say, you know, oh, you know, one of these conditions is an improvement because, I mean, you know, it's like de facto slavery. Or, you know, as you may know, the Old South ran this program for, this is a, you know, become a call to celebrate lately. The Old South ran this program, you know, for quite some time, where if you were basically convicted of a minor offense as an African American in Mississippi in the 1930s, maybe a little earlier than that, you basically wound up as effectively a slave.
You're on the chain gang, which is pretty much
You had the whole chain gang thing, and so the thing is that it's like these are sort of the question of like. I mean, these are very hard questions, and when you hear people who are like sophisticated liberals, basically, uttering these arguments, which are the same as the arguments for slavery that Carlyle used in the 1840s, you're just like, it's like the contradiction you talked about earlier. Are you for free speech or are you against it? And it doesn't really quite parse, really. I mean, you could there are Carlyle essays about, quote, the nomadic principle, where he's like, like the principle where the only nexus between man and man is cash, where I'm like, you could be talking about Uber. And he's basically complaining about Uber and libertarianism in the 1850s, and he's saying the alternative to Uber is slavery, which is much better than the gig economy. And, to someone who's like a consumer of the 2020 intellectual discourse, that still kind of breaks your brain. It's like, is free speech good or bad? Like, nobody can give me a clear answer to that. And when something breaks your brain like that, when you see a contradiction and you can't resolve the contradiction, generally that means that your kind of frame of reference is too narrow. You're looking at a 3D object in 2D. Does that answer some of your question there? Or does that pose another question that maybe you want to answer?
Yeah, actually, so you were talking about hard questions. So earlier you mentioned Caribbean slavery, and I'm going to do a loose dot connect here. You had a great bit in UR where you talked about how, I can't remember who it was now, but he said we should send all the dissenters from England to Jamaica instead of Plymouth. And but
that was Daniel Defoe in Shortest Way with the Dissenters, which he was kind of an opaque satire. So he was like one of these fake Antifa accounts or something.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question about something there's a continuing theme in UR, and I agree with it to an extent, but I'm not sure how far you want to take it, or how far you did take it, because here's the basic gist of it. You connect modern progressivism back to like the dissenters, that I guess now they're Congregationalists, whatever that particular brand of Protestant
Congregationalist,
theology.
mainline Protestant,
right.
Dissenter, they're all synonyms.
Yeah, you refer to it as like super Protestantism, which I thought was a really funny term. Now,
it's one of my neologisms that didn't really take on. Actually, I stole that from a Time magazine article from 1945 or something.
Now, this is a dangerous argument to make, because obviously, if you take it the wrong way, it sounds familiar to one that as someone who's been on the dissident right, you've heard before. There's this group of people and their theological beliefs ultimately you lead down this path that's unavoidable. Now, do you think
you mean the trads? Are you talking about the trads?
Well, no, I was implying that there are a lot of gentlemen who I see day to day on Twitter who are dissident right-wing people who think that you can trace back all the problems with modernity in our system to, the Judaism.
Yeah. I'm very familiar with these people. In fact, listeners to this might want to head over. There's a great podcast I did, like a 4-hour podcast I did with this guy Borzoi. And I spent an hour arguing about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism with him. Which I think is entertaining, and my view is that I prevailed in that discussion. But sorry, go on.
So I saved the passage because so we're talking. You refer to, at least in the context of the Reformation, that Catholicism was right wing and Protestantism was left wing. Now, do you think are we just talking about in that context, or do you think that there is something inherently left-wing about Protestantism as a whole?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Ultimately, it starts to become a kind of theological question. I think that, you can certainly point to not a lot of cases, but some cases, certainly in the American context, where Protestantism has become right-wing, and you can certainly point to plenty of cases, notably, liberation, theology in general, where Catholicism has become left-wing. That said, you can point to cases where communism has become right-wing, such as this country called China, or arguably even Stalin really is a right-wing communist. And
Amy Therese.
Sure, there you go. Xi Jinping, Stalin, and Amy Therese. And
we love Amy here, by the way.
Yeah, I get it. But she's really a right-wing Stalinist. But many such cases. So the question of the definition of inherently, obviously that historical fact would violate your conception of inherently. But there's also a sense in which maybe you can say objectively that Stalin is a bad communist, or even that Amy Therese is a bad communist. And so you could argue that they're kind of, sort of violating the fundamental spirit of the thing. And there's certainly, when Protestantism is pitted against Catholicism from the very earliest days, there is certainly an oligarchical tone in Protestantism that is not there in Catholicism. And one of the ways of kind of categorizing early Protestantism is that it was, even in Protestantism, the idea that sort of every man should make theological, decisions, for himself, and then, of course, his women, folk, children, and slaves, was a very radical view at that time. And so if you look in English history, you basically have this kind of continuous right to left spectrum, where on the right end of the spectrum, you're like, okay, everything the Pope says is right. You're an English Catholic. You're such a Catholic that you're like one of these terrorists who wants to kill Queen Elizabeth, and you're completely a slave to Rome. Then you're like a Henry VIII Anglican, and you're like, okay, everything the English church, says is right. We have a national church, and we unhesitatingly follow the 39 articles of Anglicanism or whatever the fuck, right? And then you go down from Anglicanism to Presbyterianism. And in Presbyterianism, the basic principle, the original principle of Presbyterianism, is that essentially every government of the church should be basically by these kinds of go through these locally elected boards of not bishops, but whatever you would call them if they weren't bishops. And so you're like, Presbyterianism has this kind of ideal structure of religious government that, almost looks a little bit like the People's Republic of China or something. But it, in theory, it's basically government by church councils. And then at the most radical end of that, you have Congregationalists. And the whole idea of the Congregationalists is that every congregation makes its own democratic decisions about what the faith is. Congregationalists are also called independents in that era. And then, going down to like the radical belief that every man should interpret Jesus for himself. I don't know if anyone in, the 17th century or earlier really believed that shit because it was just too crazy.
Well, there were Catholic heresies.
You have various heresies. You have the Anabaptists, like the Munster Republic and stuff like that, which is like this weird communist cult. It's like Jonestown in Germany in the 16th century.
Yeah.
There's weird shit like that, right?
Free love seems to pop up a lot in these situations for some reason.
Yeah. So there is this, like, if the right versus left, sort of spectrum is represented as kind of unified central authority versus kind of entropic distributed authority, or central versus basically monarchy versus oligarchy, I think you can say that broadly corresponds to Catholicism versus Protestantism.
I agree with that. Right-wing Protestantism is like yeomanism, basically.
Yeah, it's a kind of, right-wing Protestantism is always, it's like, it's right-wing Protestantism is always sort of a corruption of the faith in a way. It's like it's sort of you know how in Latin America evangelical Protestantism is basically taken the place of Catholicism as a charismatic religion. Are you familiar with that phenomenon?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Anybody's in the immigration politics is keeping their eye on that.
And it also comes with it comes with like weird names. Like there are certain countries in Latin America where basically kids don't get normal Spanish names. They get like almost like African American names. They're like creative names. Like Venezuela, it's all like creative names, and that I think corresponds a lot with the decline of Catholicism. Like you're not named Juan, you're named Johnny, Johonny. That sort of seems to go along with that trend in a way.
Absolutely. That earlier thing about the free speech, I kind of ran out of breath there. It is still a good answer, but I didn't mean the contradiction with the free speech. What it meant was does a system need dissonance? Does certain systems need dissonance? There's a lot of people who it's tough when you say. See, here's the thing. I don't know who you're talking to because we all know what a shitty, dumb dissonant is. So these are the people that are just. They're just the janitors for the people they supposedly hate, right?
Well,
they go clean up the worst messes.
Let's go into the system needing dissidence for a couple of minutes here because I think that it's not so much that the system needs dissidence, is that it's very desirable to have a way to be a dissident that is harmless or even helpful to the system. And so what you'll see is that those paths of dissidence will be emphasized. And so you have the basic sort of two paths corresponding to the halves of your audience. You basically have these two paths of dissidence, and one of them is essentially where you're pretending to be a dissident, but you're actually a shill. And the other is where you're genuinely trying to be a dissident, but you actually become basically a straw man. And those are different paths, so the first path is this kind of, Antifa, anti this, anti that activist where you're like, I want to destroy society. And then you have this really uncomfortable realization that you're basically believing the same things that Jeff Bezos is funding and that all the, you're when you look at the politics that you support when you go to one of these protests and riots,
Citigroup feels the same way.
Yeah, it's hard not to notice today that you're on the side of just like all power and all corporations and everything in this country. It's really kind of embarrassing, actually, and I think that that's going to make it very hard to keep the charisma of these movements going, or you're going to have to find some way to be much more radical than like Cisco and AT&T and Ben and Jerry's. And maybe there's a way to construct that without sort of flipping over to the other side. I don't know. It's looking pretty hard these days. And so that kind of dissident is a very useful kind of dissident because you're not contradicting the messages of the system. You're overemphasizing this. And so it's like arguing to the Pope that the Pope should be even stronger. Or I think in maybe even in Nazi Germany, there were like ultra Hitlerites who were like, Hitler isn't doing enough. I don't know. I may be making that up. But certainly in the Soviet Union, there were Stalinists who were more Stalinist than Stalin. And, whenever basically your way of being a dissident is to basically say to the powers that be, you're not powerful enough. Like that's a chorus that the powers that be love to hear. And that's why basically, the Ford Foundation has been supporting black radicals for 50 years. I mean, this was the idea of basically wealthy American capitalists funding, street gangs is, I mean, if you've read your Tom Wolfe, that's a 50-year-old phenomenon. And
he had an incredible story about basically a pipeline that would funnel NGO money to literal street gangs.
Street gangs. And so that they backed off from that. That was a bridge too far, but
well, for then, but maybe not now.
Well, yeah, maybe that'll change a little bit. I mean, there's sort of these vast, amounts of money being funneled at something called Black Lives Matter, and when I look at that as an organization, it doesn't hardly even seem to exist, which makes me wonder where all that money is going. It's certainly going into somebody's wallet, and so that's like, that way of being a dissident. You start to become conscious that it's this like,
power petitioning itself.
Yeah, it's power petitioning itself. It's like Putin did the same kind of thing. He created this Putin created this okay, he's kind of a Russian nationalist, and so he likes to have this ultra Russian nationalist opposition group that's actually supporting him, or that's nominally opposing him by saying, he hasn't gone far enough, right? And so it's this really fundamentally kind of embarrassing thing. And then on the other side of the table, you have basically these Nazis, and these Nazis are like. It's like the way I describe kind of the impulse of becoming, like a teenage Nazi in this day and age, and I regret the extent to which I've given. Well, I don't regret anything. Fuck that. No, that song.
First we were going over how Hitler could have been better, and now we're Pied Noirs.
Forget Hitler. These 15-year-old kids in high school don't have anything to do with Hitler. It's like you're in, but you're some fucking high school kid in shithole Indiana, right? And you're too smart for your own good, and basically you get assaulted with this fucking propaganda, right? And because I went to Brown in the 80s, I have, some idea of what this experience is like. But, you get just soaked in this shit from kindergarten on now, right? I mean, kindergartners get it.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so kindergartners get it. And my children have gotten a little bit of it. And my approach to child rearing is very much, I do never indoctrinate my children. They actually... until they basically believe that I have very little interest in politics, and because we don't talk about it at home, and it's hard to keep that from older kids, right? But
that's the best virtue you could learn on this episode.
That's really good.
Yeah. I'm just you're going to experience this, and you're going to make up your own minds, right? And so they go to school, and basically, what happens is to a kid these days. Generation Z, or I don't know if you're gonna. What's after Generation Z? Is it Generation AA or something like that? Fine, we'll say Generation Z. And Generation Z goes to school, and they basically get this stuff, and they get these messages, right? And these messages were really, really inspiring and life changing, and just unbelievably, incredibly fresh and life changing to their grandparents. And so basically what's happening to these kids now is they go to school, and they're trying to be, basically their teachers are trying to convince them that what their grandparents found cool and exciting is cool and exciting. And maybe the existence of Trump helps with this, I think, a great deal, because it's possible to be we're resisting Trump. In a Biden administration, this stuff is just going to be death. And that's why one of the many reasons I'm so pro-Biden. And, they're basically filled full of this, just they go to school every day, and everything they learn is just soaked in this cough syrup. It's just this cloying, disgusting, sweet taste of social justice everywhere, right?
Oh, yeah, it's in everything.
From kindergarten and everything. And the thing is, of course, as a child, your ability to rebel develops. And so at first you suck down this stuff, you love it, it's delicious. And maybe, because you can feel like you're part of the resistance of Trump, it stays delicious, into high school. But, I think for a lot of kids, especially the smarter ones, they're just like, at a certain point, they're just like, this syrup is disgusting. And they get like, the taste is just like overwhelmingly bad. It's stale. It's awful. And then, you know, something happens to them and they're like, they raise their hand in school or whatever, and they ask it, they're like, you know, maybe they ask their guidance counselor, like, okay, what's the opposite of this? And the guidance counselor, it's very simple. It's Hitler. And they're like, at that point, they're like, okay, baby.
Well, okay.
Wow! You know, and at that point, it's sort of, you know, and they attach themselves to sort of the most taboo possible belief, which is, you know, Hitler did nothing wrong. You know, the Holocaust never happened. You know, fuck you. My God, wow. Did you know that, like, all our media networks are owned by Jews? Did you know that 56% of our university presidents are Jews, right? You know, these are true statistics, right? And they fall down the Jew hole. And, you know, you probably, I mean, I'm sure there are readers out there now who are down that straight Jew hole. You should really go to Borzoi's, I forget what his hyper podcastism. Go to Borzoi's, you know, podcast, and you can hear me having this argument for 4 hours. You know, with I wouldn't call him a Nazi, but he's certainly a maybe he would call himself a counter Semite. And
that Jew hole, the Jew hole. That's what
right. And the thing
I fell down that.
What they don't realize when they fall down the Jew hole is they're basically giving themselves into the hands of the enemy. If they think of the enemy as the Jew, fine. You know what, kids? If you fall down the Jew hole, you're giving yourselves into the hands of the Jews. You know, the enemy isn't really the Jew, of course, speaking as a Jew. And the way I know that is simply that I have seen the top social stratum of society, and at that top stratum, no one cares who is a Jew. Also, there's a lot of Jews. And the thing that you've done by inhabiting this, you know, basically what your guidance counselor told you is that Hitler is the Antichrist. And you're like, okay, I'm going to go, you know, full Sex Pistols. I am an Antichrist.
You can't make in a movie, you can't make a villain who's not cool. It's just impossible.
Right.
No matter,
you know, and then you're like, wait a second, I'm not sure, you know, I can be a Nazi. Do the Nazis have cool uniforms? Okay, fine, I'm a Nazi, right? You know, and so you
if they just did the part of working out and doing the Hugo Boss, they might not even have to.
Hugo Boss, exactly. He designed the SS uniforms, right? And so you fall into the Nazi hole. And what you don't realize when you're falling into the Nazi hole, and I really, children out there, anyone listening, young people, old people, if you're in the Nazi hole, I implore you to pull yourself out, but not for the same reason everybody else implores you. And the reason I implore you to pull yourself out is that basically when you fall into the Nazi hole, you're basically taking on this persona of the Antichrist, and you're actually inhabiting our system's caricatures of its enemies. And so you're basically saying, oh, well, you know, your teacher, you know, purveyors of this, you know, disgusting blue cough syrup, has decided that the opposite of this cough syrup is X, so I'm going to be X. And I'm like, well, you know, what you're doing there, the mistake that you're making is you're basically being the enemy that your enemy wants you to be.
And you're making the threat real. Yeah,
you're making the threat real. And the way, you know, what you actually do when you do that is by inhabiting this caricature. This, you know, here you have this like profoundly self-righteous, you know, sort of permanent bureaucracy built on lies. And what this bureaucracy is saying is, it's saying anyone who opposes us is Hitler. And when you say I oppose you and therefore I'm Hitler, you're validating it, which is a deeply fucked up thing to do at every level, including at a basic military level, because you're basically doing what your enemy wants and expects you to do. And, you know, while we're talking about Hitler, there's a funny coincidence in history which I think is too little remarked on, which is that in World War I, as you may know, you have this incredible program of anti-German propaganda, where people are like, the Germans are Huns, and they're cutting off women's breasts with bayonets, and they're basically raping Belgium. Why should you fight against Germany, young American, to prevent the Hun from raping your sister? I mean, if you've ever seen any World War I propaganda, whether it's, like posters, you're like, this is for 11-year-olds. This was basically a war fought by people with like a mental age of 11, because basically all you could appeal to is the Hun is coming to rape your sister. And of course, the real sort of diplomatic history reasons for World War I are far more complicated and far more grown up. But this is what is sold to people around the world. At least it was what was sold on the Allied side. So Allied intellectuals, or Anglo-American intellectuals, were very discomfited after the war when basically all of these atrocity stories turned out to be vastly exaggerated or not true. Actually, the Germans had mostly behaved as according to what they considered the laws of war, which were kind of brutal 19th century laws of war. But they were very kind of proper and legalistic about it. They weren't, World War I, they really weren't doing any Holocaust. And so you had this whole system where the Germans are sort of charged with these atrocities, which they're actually not committing. And then what's deeply fucked up about World War II, I mean, not that there isn't anything that isn't deeply fucked up about World War II, but what's deeply fucked up about World War II is that in World War II, the Germans actually behave like they were accused of behaving in World War I. So like one of the charges in World War I is that they have like these corpse factories that are turning like corpses into like edible fats or something. Okay, the Germans did not actually make soap out of Jews, like, all historians agree with this, but, did they have something kind of like corpse factories? Yeah, they actually did. Did they commit, like, vast fucking atrocities? I don't know any Holocaust denier that would, be like, no, the Nazis did everything right. And so the irony is that in World War II, on the Allied side, this atrocity propaganda is almost absent. Actually, the Allies never mentioned the fucking Holocaust during the war. They receive accurate reports of the Holocaust and they fucking cover it up. And so you have this fucked up situation in which the Germans in World War II are accused of doing shit that they weren't actually doing. And then in World War I, they're accused of doing shit that they're not actually doing. And then in World War II, they're not accused of shit that they're actually doing. How fucked up is that?
There was a great moment in World War I after the Russian Revolution when the I guess whatever it was before the Politburo released.
They released all the documents, right? And so they were like, the Allies are like, we promised the Russians they could take Constantinople, and they released all this fucking diplomatic history, which is not supposed to be fucking seen.
Carving up the Levant like a Thanksgiving turkey.
Right. And so like World War I is like completely fucked. Like the two wars, it's interesting, just as that digression, the two wars that you can totally deconstruct without getting in any kind of trouble are World War I and the American Revolution. And, both of them are just like these totally fucked conflicts, right? And, but World War II, to get back to the subject that we were on, which is Nazis, or neo-Nazis, or fake Nazis, or bullshit, high school Nazis, in a way, Hitler does the same thing that these bullshit high school Nazis are doing. Because he's basically like, after World War I, the Germans are presented with this choice. Either you have Weimar liberalism, in which you basically accept this just totally fucked up scene of and they're like starved after World War I, the whole Treaty of Versailles is this massive fraud, all this fucked up shit is going on. And either you're like, okay, yes, thank you, come in my face again. Let me, my God, you Englishmen, I love you so much. Either you have that attitude or you're like, fuck you, England. And if you're going to be like, fuck you, England in Germany, which you have more than adequate cause for, as I think any legitimate historian would agree, if you're going to be like, fuck you, England, naturally liberalism is the ideology of England. So if you're going to be like, fuck you, England, you're going to be like, fuck you, liberalism. And you're basically going to be like, I'm going to, but liberalism is still ideologically, it still has that same hegemony that it has, among, teachers in American high schools today. So when you're like, fuck you, liberalism, you basically do the same thing of inhabiting this caricature. And so you're like, okay, wow, Either you're a liberal or you're a Hun who bigots women. And you're like, okay, I guess I'm a Hun. And that's kind of, where a lot of this incredibly perverted Nazi ideology comes from. And it is incredibly perverted. And, happy to have that debate again if there are any more Nazis that want to debate me. Where this incredibly perverted ideology comes from is that it's still liberalism. It's just this perverted inverse of liberalism. And, so in a way, it's like you think that you're sort of escaping from this slavery, but, practically you're reaffirming this slavery because you go and do your Holocaust or your school shooting or whatever. And people are like, see, either you're a liberal or you're a school shooting Holocaust person. So like you're supporting it objectively, but you also kind of haven't escaped from that frame philosophically. And that's why that is the real reason, kids, that you should not be Nazis and you should stop being Nazis. Does that make a certain amount of sense?
Yeah. Can I attack you for a second?
Please.
Okay. So 6 minutes. I'm just kidding. A couple months back on Medium, you wrote something about the I call it the bat flu, coronavirus.
Yeah, the bat flu.
And it was the first thing that you wrote that made me angry. I really didn't like it, and you can probably guess which part I didn't like.
Was it? I mean, that was like my ultimate lockdown piece, right?
Yeah. So the first part, and you can tell me if I'm mischaracterizing this.
Sure.
First part, you say we need a coronavirus authority, and essentially we need to run it like a private industry. It's going to have a very specific jurisdiction.
Do it right. Yeah, basically run it like a country-sized, like fucking China, basically.
Right.
He kept reading, by the way. Read the whole thing. Yeah, that's there you go.
Yes. Yeah, so whatever. I don't agree with that, but okay. But you got to the end, and this is what I didn't like. You wrote, and let me quote you. Here's the answer without sugar. Americans are children. They are puerile, spoiled, and arrogant. When they look in the mirror, all they see is a king or a queen. Can kings be managed like wildlife? A king is not an elk.
Yeah.
Now, this is in the context of you were comparing us to Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, places that were monitoring people, and direct
places
monitoring.
that were much more successful in suppressing this disease.
Okay. I don't disagree with that. So earlier in our conversation, we kind of danced around the topic. So do you believe that there are like a national character of people?
Yeah. I mean, in a very broad, blurry sense, certainly.
Right.
Some of that is cultural, some of that is genetic. It's some of that could come from the fucking language. I don't know. It's very hard to tease apart. But certainly the national character of Finland is very different from the national character of Haiti.
Right, and this is part, and I would say, and I would argue with you, this is part of our national character. As we said before, it's a nation that was founded by Anglos, borderers, you threw in some Protestant Germans. We're people who we don't like to be tagged like cattle.
Well, yeah. So basically, like I think that's
you spent years as a libertarian.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that in retrospect, knowing what we now know about the disease, there are basically two approaches to it that haven't been fucked, and those approaches have been basically the extreme approaches of either Taiwan, Singapore, maybe South Korea, and even China versus Sweden. And I think Sweden has had I was very skeptical of the Swedish approach. They have had more deaths than a lot of their neighbors. That's true. Those deaths have, I think usually, I certainly, when I wrote that post, I didn't appreciate, as most people didn't appreciate, how age biased this disease is in its damage. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if a middle-aged person like me getting this disease, that could easily knock 3 to 10 years off of your life expectancy, even if it doesn't kill you. Because I know people who are basically COVID long haulers. And I'm doing everything possible not to get this shit. I'm still doing everything possible not to get this shit. That said, the Swedish approach to herd immunity here you have this this comparison of humans to animals again, has been like, I mean, if you look at their death rates, they basically, as in a lot of places, have gone very close to zero without quite as much sort of craziness and damage. And so, in a way, when I say that, Americans are children, I mean, the thing is, I'm guessing you guys don't actually have children. I do have children, and so I mean that perhaps in a more positive way than you might think, or than most people might think.
That's a good point.
We're staying up all night talking about politics, so yeah.
yeah. I mean, a child has an essentially sort of lovable quality, and you also want your children to have as much freedom as they can possibly have without damaging themselves. And so the thing is that when I think of something like, okay, a lockdown, I'm like, this is something, the lockdown to do is something like the Chinese lockdown, or even the New Zealand lockdown, the Iceland lockdown or something. First of all, like why anybody was allowing Pacific or even transatlantic flights in February was, utterly unclear to me. Actually, my first coronavirus post, which was written in late January, was like, just turn off the fucking flights. Jesus fucking Christ.
Yeah.
And like, this is like, how, like, when you look at a political system that can't make a decision as obvious as that, when, like, what? Like, we trust these people for what, right? You can't even, like, I mean, you're flying out of a pandemic, and and that was my first post on the subject. And so when you look at the way, I mean, I think that my idea of advocating the Chinese solution for America was, okay, to a certain extent I was trolling in a way, and to a certain extent I was trying to get people to recognize the value of that. To a certain extent, or like, more like Taiwan than China. I mean, Taiwan is, I think, of all the countries in the world that have handled this, I think Taiwan has arguably handled it the best, because it's done a very good job of sort of doing kind of appropriate blockage, and it handled it almost perfectly as far as I'm aware, with like really very minimal impact on civilians. And if you can sort of, taking Taiwan as the picture of how to handle this fucking garbage fucking disease, what you see is that there's this kind of, most people, if they're like libertarians, they think of force and violence as equivalent. And they think of, okay, the more, like, when you think of like a lockdown, you're going to sort of handle this with like maximum violence or something. And in a way, China kind of fulfills that, because the whole Chinese government is a very, very blunt instrument. And it has this kind of, still has this kind of Maoist tendencies. And it's just like, we are going to lock down everything, and you're going to stay in your apartment, block, and you're like, apartment block leader, which still exists from like the Maoist days, is going to become like the like petty dictator of your apartment block. They didn't really have that in Taiwan. And so they had to basically just realize that this was a problem very early, keep almost everybody with the condition out of Taiwan, and then just track the fuck out of anyone who came into the country. And it's like, if you landed in Taiwan, they like, took sort of complete charge of your quarantine for like the next 2 weeks. They like, installed software on your cell phone and like tracked your presence. And the result was that the infringements on civil liberties in Taiwan, which had this much more authoritarian perspective, were actually much, much less than the infringement, like
the half measure that
less than the infringements in America, where we still have these fucking lockdowns, right? Which are just like fucking not working and fucking destroying a lot of people's fucking lives, including some of the fucking best people in America, who are the people that run little fucking businesses, right?
Well, well, you wrote something similar about this, about how we thought about war, and the classic foreign policy sense. The idea is you get the war over as fast as possible. It's a very, very German idea. World War One. There we go. That happens.
All right. How long should I rewind there?
About a minute, I think, is all it's.
All right. Well, let me just start the story I was telling again, which is that as a kid, I was born and bred as a globalist because I grew up as a foreign service brat. And when you're in these in the environment of being a kid of one of these embassies, there's basically two kinds of Americans there. Two kinds of American adults, that is. There's the foreign service officers who are, members of the most elite service in the federal government. It's so elite that it's even a separate service. Like, if you're a normal government employee, you have a GS rank. But in the foreign service, you have an FS rank. And that's considered definitely cooler. And, of course, the profession of the foreign service is essentially to rule the world. So if you decide as a young person, maybe you got into like Model United Nations in high school, you want to rule the world, you go to Georgetown, you study in the School of International Affairs or whatever the fuck it's called. You take the foreign service exam, and then you're part of this bureaucracy of like 20,000 people that rules the world. That's pretty cool, and that attracts a lot of kind of high status, high quality people. My father had actually been a philosophy professor before he took the foreign service exam, so that's the kind of this is a very high toned Americans. And then the second kind of Americans you have in these strange foreign lands is Marines, who are sent there to guard the embassy. And the Marines these are not special Marines, they're not different Marines, they're Marines, right? And so their children are the children of Marines. And the children of the foreign service officers are children of foreign service officers. And so these are two very different social classes. And one of the things I discovered is that, you have this sort of interesting relationship as a kid in these places where the people your parents hang out with are these like basically local fucking degenerate third world aristocrats. And of course their children are like sent to like global institutions, will study at Oxford or whatever. They're citizens of the world too, right? They're part of the same social class as you. In fact, they have way the fuck more money than you. Part of the weird experience of becoming a foreign service brat is, my father he got for a brief biography of my dad, he got a PhD in philosophy from Brown, went off to teach philosophy in the early 70s. A lot of people wanted that job. He was kind of a dick like I am. He didn't get tenure at the University of Winnipeg. He's like, fine, I'm going to write a novel. Moved to California with his wife, was raising some kids at that time, working on his book, and he's like, and he was on welfare. And he's like, well, to be on welfare, I need to prove that I'm looking for a job, so I'm going to go through this foreign service hiring process, right? So he takes the foreign service exam, and it's this like long period. They call him back. He does this other thing, and then they call him, and they're like, hey, you've been admitted to the foreign service. You have 48 hours to make a decision. So he basically is like, okay, fuck it. And we go from living in this like fucking shitty, like, walk-up apartment like next to the train tracks in Palo Alto. And then like 6 months later, we're in this fucking drug dealer compound in Santo Domingo, right? I mean, with like fucking broken glass on the walls and like marble floors. And I'm like, what the fuck? This is weird. And so the point is, as a kid in this society, you're basically, some of your friends are going to be the children of these local aristocrats. And then some of your friends are going to be the children of the Marines. And you're like, in a way, in some ways, I actually have more in common with the children of the Marines than I do with these sophisticated kids. Like, for example, I know how to throw a football. I had these funny experiences where I would like hang out with my friends and try to teach them to throw a football, and it was like, wow, Yeah, right. And
Jesus Christ.
So I started to realize that I actually had more in common with like the Marines than I did with the rest of the global elite, and that was a realization that kind of stuck with me in some ways. So my feeling basically as an American, as like a basically hereditary Bolshevik aristocrat. I guess my grandparents on my mother's side weren't communists. I'm like, hey guys, your impulse as a Bolshevik is to be a patron and to go out and say, oh, I'm like a member of the, I'm like Lenin, I'm a fucking noble, I'm going to go out and like raise my army of the proletariat. And most sort of aristocrats from my background interpret that as, okay, the proletariat, the working class no longer exists. What we're going to do is we're going to, raise an army of the POCs. And that's going to be our sort of patron-client structure. And I'm just like, but I just love like the kulaks. I love like middle Americans, like they're not me. They're not who I am. But, like I kind of like them. And so who the fuck is raising an army of these people? Kind of no one. And the people who are doing it really fucking badly. And that's sort of where that kind of Nietzschean urge kind of naturally draws me. Now I can explain that rationally. These people are getting fucked in the ass. If you'll excuse my French. But there's like something like, that set of people and, those sort of borderers, like, the bass boat people that you're describing are definitely kind of the core of that ideology. And I like, these are very simple, these are like simple, good people basically. And I just hate to see them getting fucked. And yeah, that is a little bit like the way my grandfather reacted to like the garment workers of New York or something. But so be it. That's kind of where I emotionally am with my sympathy for the kulaks.
Yeah, well, every red diaper person either becomes like a right wing dissident like you, or they become super
they stick with the program. Yeah.
I had a flip side of this experience. That proverbial Jew hole. I fell down that. I was a frat boy in South Florida, so you can do the math on that.
Damn. Yeah.
The thing with the PMCs, I mean, they're in a difficult position. They gave I don't know how to really. So they gave like 10 times as many people like these degree like you didn't really need a ton of philosophers.
Yeah, no shit. What'd you major in?
Accounting.
Right.
Yeah, because this is working class. Well, you to go get there to learn a task. Yeah, I never knew. Like I had never even heard of grad school until like 2 or 3 years after I had left. No idea.
Yeah. Well, see, I had a similar but opposite experience where basically, I was going to go to college and, I was like, my dad is like, what do you want to study? And I'm like, history or, maybe even philosophy. And, my dad is basically like, well, I'm sure you'll enjoy paying for that.
Yeah, well, there's
so I went to college and I learned a trade, and it was the trade of being a computer programmer. Fairly good trade to choose, I think, at that time. And that was definitely good parenting. But I of course grew up with the absolute opposite assumption.
My best friend in high school, he was a Jewish guy. His dad was the richest guy in town. Shock! Don't fall out of your seat there.
Now is this the part of South Florida, like the like West Palm Beachy kind of area that's full of Jews? Is this
So I went. So later on, I went to school down there. I know. So that'd be like Boca. Where I went to school had a shit ton of people from there, basically. So my fraternity was basically like Italian guys and Jews. But my best friend in high school, he was Jewish, and one thing we could certainly see come together was the cheap parents. So his dad was the richest guy in town. He owned all these businesses and stuff, but he owned like all the things. So he had the shitty cheap. His dad didn't get a job. He didn't give him any fucking money at all, and we could.
I'm not sure that was because he was cheap. He might have just wanted to build character.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was. Yeah. I mean, the way Josh is very successful these days. You can see you can see all the decisions he made. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, so his dad had all the money in the world, but he made him. He's out here working a shitty job for everything he had. But like as soon as it all the points were like buying your kid like a nice car and shit like that. Does that make you feel good? Yeah. Does that really help them? I don't know. But as soon as his son's like, I'd like to invest in something, then he peeled off a couple dollars, and that's the little force multiple. Yeah, that's
Yeah, that's a pretty useful kind of cultural capital there. I don't know if it. I don't know if that cultural capital really. I would be surprised if that cultural capital, actually dated back to some kind of old world finance situation. I think it's just the situation that as your friend is probably a Yiddish speaking Jewish ancestry, not German speaking, right?
I know Ashkenazi and I know Sephardi. The Ashkenazi,
within
Jerry Seinfeld.
Ashkenazi. So this is important. This is an important piece of Jewology that everybody should know, which is that within the Jews who came to America, there are German-speaking Jews and Yiddish-speaking Jews. My paternal ancestors are Yiddish-speaking Jews, and these populations are roughly as different as
who got here first?
Borderers. And so, that may seem like, people will be like, oh, a Southerner's a Southerner. No, actually, no, it's not so. And they actually had racial slurs for each other. So a big aspect of the Holocaust is that basically Hitler, being a fucking idiot, is essentially saying to the influential Jews of America, who may not be running America but are certainly influential, hey, I'm going to hold your compatriots hostage. And what he didn't realize is that he was basically holding mostly a bunch of Yiddish-speaking Jews hostage in order to influence the behavior of German-speaking Jews. So that's basically, that's like saying, okay, I hate, white people, so I'm going to hold a bunch of Trump voters hostage to influence the writings of the New York Times editorial page, right? And basically, the response is not going to be like, all right, what are you waiting for? Gas them already. But it's going to have elements of that, right? And because these are of course, the editors of the New York Times did not actually want the Yiddish-speaking Jews of the Ukraine gassed. Of course they didn't want that. On the other hand, they certainly felt a great deal of contempt for these people. And so as a Yiddish-speaking Jew, I'm kind of on the other side of that, where I'm like, oh, yeah. I remember when you guys let us get gassed,
Yeah, you don't pick up on the first ring there.
Yeah, exactly. You only pick on the first ring there. But, there's a lot of inside baseball there. But
the people who actually, here's a little genocide 101 for you guys out there. The way you actually do it is, it's the reverse. The people like Cortez and stuff, you divide and conquer. You say, hey, those guys living next door to you, I'm this third party that just showed up, and I'll help you fuck them up.
Yeah. Basically, the Romans love to do that. So I took you on this Jew-hole digression, though. You were talking about your friend Josh.
Oh, I was done there. Sorry. Here, okay. I don't know how much. Second, you got to tap out. You got a family and everything. But okay, there's one of the big themes at graymirror.substack.com, $10 a month.
Yes, buy it now. Don't even think. Buy it now.
The good old boys will be at a monster truck rally signing autographs next week for the big Trump reunion. So there's a couple. So that one, you put. You're opening up to a wider audience because I know so that used to be more brash. So here's a little thing you put. Please remember, this was a thought experiment. The point of an experiment is to illustrate the selective forces that determine the popularity of a cause. Because after that document that you wrote about where it says we'll just track all these guys and stuff. Our pal Dave the Distribuist, he's like the guy that where. I was like, he has a YouTube channel. He started talking about reactionary ideas and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I was blown away. I was like, I had never heard any. Like these guys got some answers. That, like, that's when I just kept I kept sending all this stuff to Merrick. I was like, you got to read this shit. You got to read this. I was sending your stuff, by the way.
Right.
Okay, one of the big themes back on track. One of the big themes is that we want this. We want responsibility, accountability, and power. We want this. I don't know if it has to be one party state, but there's got to be a guy responsible. You know where he is. You know what he looks like, and he has the power to make executive decisions. Why is okay? This is something that's very hard to find these days. Are the lights too bright? Why is there things just advanced? So why is this so rare now?
Why is what so rare exactly? People who want responsibility, who want to be accountable for. I think it's not rare.
Why? Yeah, informal. Why is it so much informal power versus so much formal power? Right?
Yeah, because informal power works just very, very differently from formal power, and when you have accountability, it's like, man, it's so fucking stressful. I mean, I've been the CEO of a company. It's so like nobody wants that job. It's fucking heinous. My digestive system has never recovered. And so the thing is, and that's so magnified in politics, and it's so magnified in a place like, I mean, when you're a bureaucrat, like power is so fragmented and so fractured within, the U.S. government as it exists now. And, it's not even power. It's sort of relevance. It's like, if you look at instances, let's sort of look at instances in which the very rare instances in which kind of an individual has done something that had really enormous effects. I would say the top of that is basically what the Gates Foundation did with Common Core. You've probably heard of Common Core. Are you guys young enough that you had like Common Core in school?
No, I'm only about 10 years younger than you, but
and you don't have kids that have been subjected to this horror. It's funny. I'm now. My kids were they were never in public schools. They were always in kind of, private schools. And, now I'm homeschooling them. And, I'm a little perturbed to discover that, for example, my 10-year-old son, who's no dummy, did not know how to multiply 2-digit numbers. This is all basically the doing of common. I teach him this. He's like, God, I could have learned this when I was 5, that's Common Core for you. And Common Core is basically the work, and I forget this person's name, it's basically the work of one person. And somehow this one person managed to get kind of his view of what a curriculum should be adopted by the Gates Foundation and managed to do all the like bureaucratic political things right to make it basically the centerpiece of American education. But this is not someone who was elected by anyone. I mean, the sort of the old American tradition of education, which is kind of, ridiculous in these days, is like the locally elected school boards, which assumes that you have this like Norman Rockwell society where everyone sort of cares about what's being taught in like little one-room schoolhouse. It's like, it's one of the many American, sort of political structures just completely not designed for the modern world because it's designed for people who are much better than we are. And
horrible psychos show up to those kinds of meetings where things are.
Oh my God! Yeah, the public. It's like like the staple of like public access TV, right? Like the community meeting where you're looking for like the the Norman Rockwell experience, and you get these like this mix of psychos and bureaucrats, right? And the bureaucrats generally defeat the psychos. Although I have to say that the influence of like San Francisco coffee house bulletin boards has become somewhat greater than one could have imagined. But here you have this, to get back to this, here you have this case in which this sort of one person actually created this monstrosity, but he didn't create it because like America elected him his president of education. He created it in a way that was basically much more Soviet, that actually was very similar to any kind of Soviet politics. In fact, this guy probably would have excelled in the Soviet Union at getting his curriculum, adopted nationally, except that the Soviet curriculum was actually much better, at least in terms of math. Put that aside, what this person does on a daily basis does not involve thinking about how well what I did worked. Because he wants to think about how well what I'm doing works, but he's thinking about this in this abstract sense. he's not sort of part of the cycle where he tries to do shit, and if he does something fucked up, it like rebounds on him, and he's like, holy shit, man, I wish I hadn't tried that. Whereas when you're actually in a position that's sort of both accountable and responsible and authoritative, you're basically constantly being forced to experience the consequences of everything that you do that's fucked up. And that's how you sort of gain this sort of feeling of being a mature leader, to be honest. That's how you feel like you're like, if I was in the Iliad, like I could have been like hanging out with like Nestor and Agamemnon, and they would have like listened to what I had to say, right? And when you're a person who may be very, very successful, I mean, this is, whoever it is, I forget this guy's name. He's a big man. Like, I'm sure when he calls an Uber, it's always an Uber XL, and like, when people talk to him, they're like, hello, Mr. So-and-so, can I get your autograph? Like, when he gives speeches, he gets paid for it. And yet, the experience of having to deal with the consequences of the shit he fucked up does not exist. If you go and look at our war in Afghanistan, like, here we have this war that's been going on for almost 20 years, There's
a war?
Yeah, complete failure to win it. Nobody's like succeeded at all. I'll tell you a story about the war in Afghanistan, actually. Never been to Afghanistan, but at one point I was at a San Francisco, I wasn't working there, but a San Francisco venture capital firm invited Stanley McChrystal, who had been the commanding general in Afghanistan until he got fucked in the ass by Michael Hastings of Rolling Stone. You might remember this story.
Yeah.
Therefore, but he's like, a special forces guy, commander in Afghanistan. So he goes to this San Francisco venture capital firm, and he gives a talk. And, I managed to get myself in on this talk. And this talk is like, it lasts an hour or something. It's clearly a canned talk, which has been given many times. But this guy he's tight. He's with it. He can do, he's 60 years old and he can do 100 push-ups. I mean, he didn't do 100 push-ups for us or whatever. And at the end of this, I'm like, okay, I'm going to hit the ball past this guy. I'm going to ace him. I'm going to ask a question. So I raise my hand, and I get called on, and I ask my question. I'm like, there's no way he can answer this fucking question. And my question is, I'm like, okay, here you are in this part of the world, Indian subcontinent, right? And you're basically a Westerner trying to govern, part of the Indian subcontinent. And you must realize that you're not the first Westerner to do this, and you're not the first generation of Westerner to do this, and you're not even the first century of Westerner to do this. I didn't say it exactly like this. And so I'm like, so let's say an Indian district commissioner from the Raj could evaluate our performance, our American performance in Afghanistan. What do you think they'd think of how good a job we were doing? And he was just like, yeah, I think they'd think we were doing a pretty lousy job. And I'm like, boop, no further questions. Like, he clearly, like, he didn't skip a fucking beat before answering that. And he clearly thought about the matter himself. And yet, nobody is like, who else is asking him that fucking question, right? Nobody. And so there's this extent to which you have this whole sort of military bureaucracy. And, if you know anything about the military, it's not easy to become a general. I mean, these are talented, capable people, and yet they just lose and fucking lose. Or at least they don't win. And, people get killed and money gets spent and nothing good happens and it doesn't fucking work. And this is a world in which, like, once you can't even hold generals accountable for not winning wars, the reality is you haven't even really given them the power to win the war because they're not actually in charge of how the army is run. Most of the problems are like at the JAG level, to be honest, if you know what that is. Mm-hmm. And, that sense of being in command but not being in command, of having this sort of sense of like you're in charge, but like when you're appointed the commanding in general in Afghanistan, the reality is you can't win the war and nobody cares if you win the war. And that is like, war, that is like, Forget all this like civilian bureaucracy. That is a very fucked up situation to be in. And like, I'm just like, yeah, whatever is happening here doesn't really work. But also, the U.S. doesn't even know how to withdraw from Afghanistan. The idea of like going back to having like an alien Islamic country, you know, in the world, which thinks it's the year 1300 something and doesn't even believe in the Western system of diplomacy, like, how do you even manage that? And so they don't even know how to lose the war. It's like, it's appalling. You know, and that's where, when you get this divorce between power and responsibility and accountability, like, you know, whether it's Afghanistan or like teaching fucking children to fucking multiply fucking 2-digit numbers, excuse my fucking French, it's just like, you know, once you have a system where you're losing and reality doesn't tell you that you're losing, you can just get arbitrarily weird.
We need to tie someone down and force a crown on them, basically.
I mean, you know, like, I think there are people capable of doing that job. You know, basically the point of Gray Mirror, which is, I'm actually starting to get into good stuff in Gray Mirror now. I've kind of worked through the preliminaries of like, let's get out of this shit that we're in. And I'm basically trying to write an instruction manual for that person, whoever he or she may be. And it's certainly an interesting exercise. I hope to sell, you know, 1 or 2 books. I think I've had a pretty good Substack response to this strange thing, even despite posting. I'm pretty sure my 20,000 word chapter 3 may have been a record for Substack posts. I should ask my like Substack customer support there if they've ever seen another 20,000 word blog post. But you know, the point is to basically say, it's like, the thing about forcing a crown on someone is that like nobody even knows what you do. Like, you can't imagine, like, what would, you know, imagine like Elizabeth I, you know, or Caesar, Augustus, like, what would they do with this country? I mean, it's a beautiful country. It's so fucked up. What do you do with it? Like, it's hard to even sort of answer that question. It's a fascinating question to me, and it's such a different question than like, what should this public policy, or like, how should we treat our criminal justice system, or UBI, or like, these are all very, very small things in comparison with the true size of this question, which is just enormous. And I feel actually kind of liberating to even think about how big a question that is.
Yeah, well,
you know,
sorry, go ahead.
there's a little anecdote from World War II. It reminds me of accountability. And he was an admiral, and he was the guy he initially came up with the concept of the kamikaze attack. He was a Japanese admiral, and to the very end of the war, he's like, "Hey, we just keep doing this. We, you know, a couple more million guys smashing into the aircraft carriers, and we're going to win." So bombs drop, the emperor surrenders. The guy goes and writes a letter. He's like, "Hey, I'm sorry, I fucked up." Stabs himself in the gut and dies.
Yeah. And
that's accountability.
That's accountability, and that was you know, himself imposing his own accountability there, and that was of course very. I mean, that's just pure Japanese family values, right? And they, you know, it was a beautiful country, and still is in many ways. You know, but it's such a different way of thinking about these, you know, like questions. I would say it's an un-American way of thinking about these questions. But the thing that America has that really enables me to realize this is, you know, if you go inside any of these big technology companies, yeah, they may, you know, censor conservatives all day long or whatever, but they're basically all run like fucking Frederick the Great's Prussia. And they're all
now we're talking.
Yeah, they're all run by people who just have this sense of, you know, of command, and who really have this capacity to command and to govern, you know, like, I mean, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of employees. What are all these people doing? They're making fucking toys, you know? And I'm just like, there's like, how is it that the people in America who are most able to get shit done are not getting shit done? And we saw a case of this with the healthcare thing under Obama. You might remember this thing where basically, you know, Obamacare had to build this website, a fucking website, right? And they built it the DC IT way. And the DC IT way was basically to spend $500 million on contractors who built something that didn't work. And then the Obama, administration was like, what the fuck? This is really embarrassing. We're really embarrassed. Can anyone please help? And because Obama, unlike Trump, was cool, there were many cool people who wanted to help out in California. Lots of cool, very, very, liberal, many, I'm sure, trans, and just amazingly talented people. And they're like, okay, website. Okay, here's your website. We did it in a week or whatever the fuck, right? And the irony of that event is that those people who did those things were able to do those things because they were trained in the Silicon Valley world of basically monarchies that work and get shit done. And that's a situation in which you basically have this kind of command authority, and people, these are not bureaucracy. A Silicon Valley company is, at its best, big ones turn into this, but a startup certainly is, very much an army and not a bureaucracy. And, ideally they're run like, the special forces. And wow, can they get shit done? And if they can't get shit done, they're basically instantly killed by someone who can get shit done. At least that's kind of the ideal. And the reality falls short of that a little bit. And that sort of couldn't be more different from Washington, even though just like the raw sort of human intelligence and capacity of the people in Washington is often very high. But, these structures that exist cannot get shit done. They're not accountable in any way. The executive branch does not actually work for the president. I don't know how anyone could be unaware of that after reading the newspapers for the last 4 years. And
yeah, that's a great reason to like Trump. It's just that people can see now that the State Department clearly doesn't answer the president. Pretty much any department that
it was super. It was, it was super educational. I think that class is over. But hopefully people won't forget the lessons from that class. I would personally, Biden winning is very much in my interest, I feel. I also feel it's generally in the country's interest for both, short-term and long-term reasons. It's a very sort of pragmatic assessment. And as I never tire of saying, my final reason for being a Biden supporter is that Biden has actually kissed my mother. Literally kissed.
Join the club, buddy.
Exactly. He just has a very, very demonstrative personal style. But yeah, my stepfather worked for him for a few years when he was in the Senate. And so yeah, I'm like, okay, that's sort of been enough lesson, and I feel like a lot of bad lessons are also being learned.
Well, you don't see the irony here, though. I mean, Trump comes from the private sector. He's in real estate.
I know. But the thing is, the irony is even greater than that. No, I do see the irony because basically we elected the only CEO who had no fucking idea how to be a CEO. The thing is, Trump doesn't actually run like the Trump hotels or all this stuff. He basically licenses this fucking brand.
It wouldn't have mattered if he did. As is very clear, the president does not run the bureaucracy.
That is true. Yes, of course that is true. But it's also, if he had actually known sort of the difference, there's a world in which he possibly could have changed that. Do you want me to? I think we're close to wrapping up, but I thought I'd do something fun and disturbing, which will break the brains of everyone in your audience.
I'd like to issue a warning here. So I know how this works, right? So this is one of the things that's tough, and people have trouble with it. But you basically have to do it. Mr. Yarvin is a right-wing guy, and he says he's voting for Biden. A lot of people, their stomach gets sick when they hear this. What are you doing? You need to explain like this massive chain of events of how this helps. Okay, you think that he's trolling. You can just, but you need to be able to. So if you worry about things that you can't control, and we're talking about things you really can't control, You're not ready.
Yeah.
For the big boy poll.
I didn't say I was going to vote for Biden. By the way, I don't vote, but I think it would be much better for the country generally if Biden wins in both the long and the short term. And that's a decision that's sort of gone so far past ideology that it's sort of come back around again. It's a completely cynical and Machiavellian viewpoint. It doesn't reflect any faith in either of these clowns.
Which is how you should vote. And by the way, more than likely, I know people that live in, if you live in New York, even if you're right wing, I kind of hope Trump isn't good for you. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, voting for Trump in New York is a different experience.
When you're talking about power and you're talking about voting, you're not ready for the big boy stuff.
Can I?
Sorry.
Yes.
Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Something really disturbing.
Bring us home.
Please do.
All right. Hang on. I got to bring up something in my here. All right. I'm going to read. I'm going to a speech. I want to emphasize that I once did this for someone, and they actually thought that these were my own words, and they got really freaked out. I'm not going to tell you whose words they are, but maybe you can guess. You guys ready?
Mm-hmm.
Ready.
All right. If I read the temper of our people correctly, we now realize, as we have never realized before, our interdependence on each other. That we cannot merely take, but we must give as well. That if we are to go forward, we must move as a trained and loyal army, willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline. Because without such discipline, no progress is made. No leadership becomes effective. We are, I know, ready and willing to submit our lives and property to such discipline, because it makes possible a leadership which aims at a larger good. This I propose to offer, pledging that the larger purposes will bind upon us all as a sacred obligation with a unity of duty, hitherto evoked only in time of armed strife. With this pledge taken, I assume unhesitatingly the leadership of this great army of our people, dedicated to a disciplined attack upon our common problems. Action in this image and to this end is feasible under the form of government which we have inherited from our ancestors. Our Constitution is so simple and practical that it is possible always to meet extraordinary needs by changes in emphasis and arrangement, without loss of essential form. This is why our constitutional system has proved itself the most superbly enduring political mechanism the modern world has produced. It has met every stress, a vast expansion of territory, of foreign wars, of bitter internal strife, of world relations. It is to be hoped that the normal balance of executive and legislative authority may be wholly adequate to meet the unprecedented task before us. But it may be that an unprecedented demand and need for undelayed action may call for temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure. I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek, within my constitutional authority, to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, and in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me were we in fact invaded by a foreign foe. For the trust reposed in me, I will return the courage and the devotion that befit the time. I can do no less. We face the arduous days that lie before us in the warm courage of the national unity, with a clear consciousness of seeking old and precious moral values, with the clean satisfaction that comes from the stern performance of duty by old and young alike. We aim at the assurance of a rounded and permanent national life. We do not distrust the future of essential democracy. The people of the United States have not failed in their need. They have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. They have made me the present instrument of their wishes. In the spirit of the gift, I take it. In this dedication of a nation, we humbly ask the blessing of God. May he protect each and every one of us. May he guide me in the days to come. End of speech. How was that? How was that experience? Who would you say made that speech?
It's got to be Roosevelt. It's got to be Roosevelt.
Bush.
You're just fucking with me. That's the last 10 paragraphs of FDR's first inaugural address.
Yeah, I knew it.
Yeah. Now imagine if like Donald J. Trump or even fucking Biden, even Kamala Harris comes out and makes that speech. People would shit a brick.
You talked about not being money. We need, that speech made a lot of reference to these sort of dignity, these things. We need funny hats back. We need public honors.
The funny hat party. I'm totally down with it. Sumptuary laws. I'm not as opposed to sumptuary laws as most Americans.
All these wars and stuff. You know, we can't outbribe the rest of the world. Outbribe our own politicians. We need the football game, you stand up and give a hand of applause to your senator, whatever, the generals, blah blah blah. We need funny hats back. We need these. We need to put people in prison for putting fake
funny hats on.
Yeah,
it's heavy on appeals to duty too. Which when's the last time you heard that?
Yeah, it's like it just shows you how different people talk about that was the original Antifa or whatever. I'm just like, you have no idea what these people were like. They were more alien than any country on earth today. I mean,
that.
It was just like, that. One of the things I've done with making that speech is just try and change the references a little bit. So instead of the United States, I say Germany, and instead of the Congress, I say the Reichstag. And then people are like, oh yeah, I get it. But why are you reading a Hitler speech to me, right?
In all honesty, I started out, I was thinking, okay, is this Hitler or is this a trick?
Yeah, right. And obviously it's a trick. But it's like, if you're like LARPing and sort of imagining that, like, yes, fundamentally this is the same regime that FDR created, but the amount, it's like saying fundamentally the Roman Empire of Honorius is the same institution as the Roman Republic of Scipio, right? I mean,
you used to say this was the Fourth Republic, right?
Yeah.
Do you still think that, or do you think we moved past number 5?
I still do think that, although I try to get that requires a lot of explanation. But basically, your 4 republics are the Articles of Confederation period, or the Congress of the Confederation from 1776 to 1789. Which was such a shitty government that it's been airbrushed out of history. It's like literally no Americans know who the first president was because it was the president of the Congress. It's like John Hanson or something. So that was the first republic, and that republic was so shitty that it was replaced by this kind of quasi-monarchical right-wing coup, whose result we now call the Constitution. And then you had the period of sort of the constitutional period from Washington through Buchanan, in which it was kind of left ambiguous whether it was a national government or a federated government. Then, of course, that question is resolved by war. Then you have Lincoln through Hoover, which is kind of your sort of Gilded Age plutocratic oligarchy, which is what the Lincoln dictatorship quickly degenerates into. And you have FDR, who's yet another monarch, and his monarchy basically degenerates into the oligarchy we know today. So you have these periods of sort of each republic, other than the first, which was really genuinely a kind of a joint effort, starts with a monarchy and kind of degenerates into a certain kind of oligarchy, and where Washington, Lincoln, and FDR are the monarchs. And when you look at that cycle, one of the things you notice is you're like, so the American Republic basically has a president who's a dictator about every 75 or 80 years. And the last time we got a president who was a dictator was about 75 or 80 years ago. So it's like an earthquake. It's like, how the San Andreas Fault will break like every 80 years. So that's another fairly disturbing thought. You've had Trump speeches that sounded a little bit like this, but Trump is sort of delivering the fake version of it.
Yeah. He doesn't really want power.
No,
he wants the trappings of power.
You see that in every case. He could have taken so much power, in the coronavirus emergency, and instead he was like, how do I get out of this? Which was it just really showed his true character very, very, very deeply. He does, as an actor, he does such a great impression of a caudillo or a dictator, and the reality is so lackluster that my God, his performance, Charlton Heston could do the same, right? But it's the same kind of performance. He's just a natural leading man, and what Americans have voted for was this natural leading man, not sort of really being aware that they're voting for an actor rather than a dictator.
The people that speech was addressed to, that's I don't know if that's cultural, because that person is waiting to be turned on in every male 18 to 30.
Yeah.
You see them throwing.
Well, and
have you heard of speed running?
I have heard of it. And the experience of the New Deal was, for the people who worked there, was just absolutely incredible. It was like working in a startup. It was just like the characteristic experience. The way I caricature this is you're a young man from a good family. You go to Harvard. You have. You're sharp. You're not just a Harvard frat boy. Even if you look like a J.C. Leyendecker painting, and you have a really cool professor, and then you graduate with a degree in this new field of economics or whatever, and your professor calls you up and he's like, "Hey, how would you like to go to Washington? We'll give you $3 million a year, and your job is to electrify Arkansas." And just you'll have the same phenomenon of these kids being given this incredible amount of money and power and responsibility. And yeah, you would go out there and you would fucking electrify Arkansas. I don't know if you've ever driven Route 1 in California, the car commercial road. And that's all built by New Dealers, making jobs for themselves to do. There's so much American infrastructure that was created by those people. And it was just working there was just this incredibly exhilarating feeling, right? And now it's you graduate from Harvard and you're like, wow, I got this unpaid internship, working in this congressman's staff. And, if I work there for a few years, they might let me write a line of legislation or something. It's embarrassing how low the stakes are for these, you must know the kind of people that were your class president or whatever, and then went off to these careers and got these unpaid internships. And it's so degrading. It's so small and bureaucratic and petty. And yet still it has this kind of mystique because people remember institutionally, not physically, of course, they remember the New Deal and when these things actually mattered. But it's just the actual, so much of the same kind of rhetoric is still used, not as 200 proof like what I just gave you, but people really still feel when they elect a president that they're electing a dictator in some way. And they still feel when they're working in the government, they're making a difference, they're making an impact. And the reality is just so banal and so horrifying. You guys must know people who've worked in Washington in some capacity or other. It's just a grim fate.
Yeah, now you're like eating out at Katie Hill, or these just.
Well, that would be sort of more the fantasy version, maybe. Depending on your views of Katie Hill, but I guarantee you that's more exciting than 99% of congressional staffer jobs.
I hate that. So thanks for coming by. I think it was fun. I hope I didn't use my southern accent too much. Well, you snuck it in there. I caught it a little bit.
All right.
You didn't say y'all, so you're not getting canceled.
graymirror.substack.com. Read it. If you're right wing, well, you're already in the game. If you're left wing, you don't have people that are super smart sit around that are openly think, well, how does power work? Like, you don't have, listen, this guy, you got, check it out. Okay.
Yeah. I would like to say we're beyond that difference, in the best possible way. And check it out. Subscribe to the mailing list. You'll get the super. If you subscribe and actually pay the $10 a month, you'll get the super secret, posts. So you'll learn about the next regime before it happens. And if that's not worth $10 a month, frankly, gentlemen, I'm not sure what is. All right. Well, this was a great deal of fun, as I expected, and I hope I lived up to your expectations at least a little bit.